Awesome. I think we can get started already. So today is session 4 on building teams and culture from day one. We're diving into one of the most defining elements of early stage growth, your team and your culture. And as you already probably know, your first hires shape your company even more than maybe your first investors. So today's session will be all about how to build the right team and the right culture for day one. So with that, I'm very excited to introduce our speaker today, Patrick Mork. He is an entrepreneur, executive coach, and best-selling author of Step Back and Leap. He coaches startup founders and CEOs across. He coaches startup founders and CEOs across the US, Latin America, and Europe. And he has worked with some of the largest tech companies out there. Before coaching, he had over a 20-year tech career, including being CMO who launched Google Play, and he's been recognized as an HR influencer as well. So we're very, very excited to have him with us today. Welcome, Patrick.
Hello, welcome. Good to be here. Excited to have everyone here.
Very, very excited to have you. With that, I'll turn over to you, Patrick, for the first part of our session. And as I said, we'll be having a quick break at 11. So Patrick, over to you.
That's great. Thank you so much. And Carlota, if you could allow me to share my slides, that would be great. Good morning, everyone. I am going to ask you that even if you're muted, I would like everybody to have their cameras on. I think that's a very important part of doing this kind of work and getting to know each other. So appreciate if people can turn their cameras on. There's always a tendency for people not to do that. And if you just rolled out of bed and you look like hell, we will all forgive you because that's what startup life is all about. So anyway, I'm going to take you through a presentation I prepared for the session today on cultures and teams. There is a lot of content, so we are going to go fast. However, don't worry about being overwhelmed. You'll have access to the slides and the recordings afterwards, and you can always shoot me an email if you if you have any questions. Can everybody see the presentation there?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Good stuff. All right. So let's see. Just got to move things around here. So we're going to start off with a little story because for any of you who know anything about me, and obviously I had a long career in tech, mostly as a chief marketing officer. I had that job 3 times, did 6 different startups, multiple of which were funded. One of them went public on the NASDAQ in 2008 as in the video game space. Another one, raised over 50 million and was valued at $350 million until it went bankrupt. So that is not a good outcome. So these things do happen. But one of the things that I've been very aware of in this process, in this journey, is the importance of culture, right? And so I want to start off by sharing a story with you guys, which I think will drive home the importance of this. This was back when I was at Google. And when I was at Google, back in 2010, this was still when Larry was running the company. So, he was CEO at Google. And we had this thing called TGIF, which stands for Thank God It's Friday. And we had that every Friday. And every Friday we would get together, the entire company would get together with Larry, and this was virtually broadcast for the people who were not in Mountain View. I was in Mountain View, so I was there in person. And Larry would give us updates on the business and would take questions from anybody in the company, right? And I think, the fact that the CEO of a company like Google would do this every Friday and take questions from anyone, I think spoke volumes at the time of the culture that Google had. And on this particular Friday, he shared a particularly sensitive and difficult topic, which was Google's position in China. And I don't know how many of you remember this, but Google went through a situation where essentially the Chinese government made certain requests of Google in terms of the way that we ran our algorithm in China and the way that we presented search results. And the demand from the Chinese government was that Google should not surface certain type of content to Chinese users and should restrict access to certain kind of conversations and certain kind of content that went against Chinese policy, Chinese positions, and the Chinese government. And it was a very difficult decision for Google, and it was one that Larry shared with the entire company, because Google was faced with a situation where, on the one hand, we could comply with the Chinese government's censorship demands and participate in what is considered the largest, or if not one of the largest, internet markets in the world, which was worth tens of billions of dollars in revenue to the company. Or on the other hand, if we decided not to comply, we would be in a position where we would be forced to leave the Chinese market. And it was an issue that the senior executives wrestled for many weeks. We were constantly kept in the loop. Larry fielded questions from executives, from people all over the company on this, and there was a lot of concern. And in the end, this was made public, Google made the decision to no longer operate in China. They made the decision that they would only operate out of Hong Kong. They would serve the Hong Kong market. They would not comply with the Chinese government's requests. And that led to not just Google search, but if you have been to China, or if you are from China, you will know that the vast majority of Google services do not operate in China. Whether that is the Google Play Store, whether that is Chrome, whether that's Maps, there are Chinese local alternatives, many of them very, very good, to Google services, and most Google services do not work properly in China. Even if you go and you try and use them, they are throttled, they do not work properly, they are not as fast, and they have many issues. And it was a conscious decision, because Larry and Sergey and the board realized that if we complied with the Chinese government, it would mean that not only were we changing our product and changing our algorithms and not necessarily serving the right content to the right people, but more importantly, it was going against Google's values as a company and Google's purpose. And Google, back in those days, I can't speak for Google today because I haven't been in the company many years, but back in those days, Google was very mission driven, right? It was a company that, that their purpose in the world, their purpose as a business, was to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. That is Google's reason for being. And one of their values is don't be evil. Now, you could argue, depending on who you are and whether you've worked with a company, that they honor that or not. And there's some element of subjectivity in that. But at the time, that was one of the most important strategic decisions that the company made, which cost the company ultimately billions of dollars in revenue. And they were willing to make it to protect their culture, because they knew that if they agreed to the demands of the Chinese government, not only was it going against the culture, but that they would potentially lose valuable employees who had made clear that if Google capitulated, they would walk, right? So I just wanted to share that story just to kind of level set how important culture is. And when you look at the most successful companies in the world that are purpose-driven, you will also realize that if you look at their financial returns over time, they typically significantly outperform their competitors. And this is not a coincidence. You look at companies like Disney, you look at companies like Nike, you look at companies like Google, like Apple, Patagonia. Many of these companies are category leaders and market share leaders, and their financial results are also a result of being very purpose and very culture driven. Okay? So when we think of culture, I want to present you with a framework for you as founders to think about, what does culture mean in my company? Because culture is a very amorphous theme. It's something that is very vague, right? And it's not, free pizzas and foosball tables and take holiday whenever you want. That's not culture, right? And anybody who says so has a very misdirected view of what culture is, right? So this pyramid, which I call the pyramid of purpose, gives you kind of a high-level idea of what culture is all about. Culture, at its essence, starts at the very top of this pyramid with purpose. And purpose, fundamentally, for your startup has to answer the question of, why do we exist as a business? Why are we here? Why are we doing what we're doing? Okay? That is the first question that every founder must be able to answer. Okay? Your purpose is not shareholder value. Anybody who believes that, I'm sorry to tell you that, that's crap. And if you believe that purpose is shareholder value, you will not attract the best talent and you will not retain your best talent, because the best talent in a company, from my experience at least, they don't come to work for you because of money. They don't come to work for you because of billion-dollar valuations. They come to work for you because they believe that your company is trying to make a difference and is trying to have an impact in the world. That is what's most inspiring. When I ran my last startup in Chile, for example, our purpose was to improve leadership and create cultures of meaning and purpose at the corporate level. That was the reason for our existence. And the reason people joined the company, even though we were paying on average 30% less salary than the market, was because they were inspired by why we were doing what we were doing. And that not only affected our ability to recruit and retain talent, it also affected our ability to attract customers. I had customers who told me, the reason we decided to work with you guys is that we felt as a team that the reason why you were doing what you were doing and the reason why you're so adamant about your values and how that's on your website, that was a differentiator for us compared to other learning and development companies who simply don't seem to care that much about it, right? Simon Sinek once said, people don't care what you do, they care why you do it. And I think that sums up nicely how important purpose is, okay? It's why we exist. It's why the company was created and what we're trying to do. Vision, and people often get the two confused, is different than purpose. Vision is, what's our vision for the future? What do we want to, who do we want to be in 10 or 20 years' time? Right? Mission, which again gets very often confused, is how do we get there? In terms of our mission, it's over the next 2 or 3 years, over the medium term, how do we actually live up to our vision? And finally, at the bottom of the pyramid is what's called your objectives and key results. That's a framework for tracking goals, which Google was very well known for using, but it actually originally came in the 1970s and 80s. It was a guy called Andy Grove who created this at Intel. And today, OKRs as a framework for tracking and setting goals is very widely used in the tech companies. Some of the most successful companies, Google, Apple, Meta, Airbnb, most of them use OKRs as a way of tracking and setting goals. So all of these things, when you look at this pyramid, are intentionally layered one on top of the other. You have a purpose, which is why you exist. You have a vision for where you want to go. You have a 2 or 3 year plan on how are we going to get there. And then you have your OKRs, which is your yearly and quarterly objectives that measure how you're delivering against your yearly goals and how that ladders to your mission, your vision, your purpose. Okay. In the backdrop of the pyramid of purpose behind all this are your values. And we're going to talk about values as well. Okay. Values is kind of like how we actually translate of this stuff into behavior. The big problem with values, which I'll get into in a minute, is that most companies, they have a couple of values. Oftentimes they have too many values and they never reinforce that, right? So show of hands, just out of curiosity, how many of you have been to the lobby of a large corporation where they have the values on the wall? Raise your hands. And that's why I said I wanted cameras on, because I can't see your hands if the cameras aren't on. Many of us have done that, right? Many of us have done that. You go into these lobbies and you see the values and you see, our values are innovation, justice, equality, fairness, transparency, whatever. And that's great, right? But unless you're living these values day to day and that's translating into behavior, it's useless, okay? So one of the most important things you guys can do as founders is to define and set in place your pyramid of purpose. Take some time with your co-founders and some of your key employees, actually draw this out and answer the questions, which are, what is our purpose? What's our vision? What do we want to achieve long-term? How do we get there over the next 2-3 years? How we get there is generally what you're building right now. And then, of course, your objectives are your objectives for the year and your objectives for the quarter. That's kind of where it starts, okay? So, moving on. How do I actually find my purpose? Because I know that purpose feels like one of these themes where it's like, especially if you're more quantitative in nature, if you're more of a finance or engineering background, purpose can feel like one of these really soft, intangible things. And people are like, what the hell is this? Like, how the hell do I figure out my purpose? So I'm going to give you another framework and another tool for that, okay? The Japanese in Okinawa came up with a very cool concept, which is called the Ikigai. And the Ikigai translates into living a life of meaning. Okay. And people often struggle with purpose at an individual level because oftentimes in society, we either don't have a clarity on our purpose as individuals, or we think that our purpose is more around passion, right? How many people out there have actually heard, if you follow your passion, life will no longer be work? Raise your hand if you've heard that before, right? Raise your hand if you've heard that. Follow your passion, follow your passion. Passion is part of it. But the problem with passion is that if I'm passionate about playing the violin, but nobody pays me for it, then I'm screwed because I can't pay the rent and I can't pay my utility bills. The same is true in your company. If you guys are passionate about solving a particular problem, but you cannot get paid for it, or you do not do it well, or there's not a big enough demand for it, you're hosed. Which is why purpose in Ikigai really has 4 components. The first component is what you love. Definitely passion is an important element of finding your purpose as a startup, as a business, right? What do you love doing? What are you passionate about as a business, right? Some of the best and most successful startups are definitely passionate about solving a particular problem. Our passion is, we're passionate about improving education in the United States. We're passionate about curing cancer. We're passionate about making healthcare affordable. We're passionate about protecting the environment. We're passionate about solving a particular problem for our clients, right? Passion is a big component of purpose, okay? But the second component is equally important, which is how good are we? What skills do we have that are going to help us deliver on that passion, right? Are we really good at cancer research? Are we really good at building technology to improve education? Because if you're not, you can be passionate all day long, but you're not going to make a lot of progress, okay? Third is, what does the world need? Is there really a demand for this? And this is critically important, guys, because so many entrepreneurs that I meet are in love with the technology or the product that they are building. And if you are in love with the technology and the product for the sake of the product and the technology, you cannot be successful. I can't stress that enough. I've worked in startups where the founders were so in love with the technology and the product that they were building that they needed to make a pivot, but they refused to do so because they were wed to the product. They weren't wed to solving the problem of the customers that they were serving. Ultimately, you have to find a niche of people who really need what you're building. The stronger the need is, the deeper your competitive moat, okay? And the more traction and retention you will have. If you create a drug that treats cancer patients and, improves life expectancy, you're definitely solving a really powerful need. And if your product is the only drug in the market that will do that, then not only do you have a very compelling proposition, do something positive in the world, but you have great customer retention, you have pricing power, you have a whole bunch of different things, right? So being very clear about what the world needs, and when I say world, I mean very broadly, right? Think of it more as a certain customer segment. It could be, our community. It could be, the university educational system. It could be, cancer patients. It could be environmentalists. It could be a group of people that need, access to better transportation, whatever. But there needs to be a very clear group of people that make up a size enough total addressable market, or TAM, that is willing to buy your product and therefore make the business scalable and financially viable, okay? And last but not least, the obvious piece is you got to be paid for it. And you got to be paid for it well enough. You got to have high enough gross margins that if there are competitors that enter the market, or if there's pressure on pricing, that you can survive, right? One of the biggest problems that you have, and this is why, for example, traditional retail is so difficult, is because the margins are razor thin, right? So if you have a 2%, or 3% kind of like, net margin at the end of the day, that is not enough to sustain a business if things get really, really competitive. So those are the 4 things that you have to answer when you are looking to define what is the purpose of my business, right? What are we excited about doing? What are we passionate about doing? What do we really kick ass at doing? What are we really good? What's our superpower? What does the world really need? What does a group of customers really need? And can we get paid for doing it? Okay? So, couple of examples of a purpose statement. And I'm going to throw these out there. You guys tell me which company has this purpose statement. Let's see. One of them is, let's see, to provide innovative solutions to every athlete in the world. Who would that be?
You can either type it in the chat or just unmute yourselves.
Yes, correct, Adriana. That's Nike. Right? They are very kind of wedded to providing solutions and products that are around innovation, to make athletes more competitive in the world, right? That's kind of why they exist, right? We've already talked about Google, right? Google's purpose is to make the world's information universally useful and accessible in a single click, right? When you have a powerful purpose statement like that, it really makes a difference to your employees. It really makes a difference to your clients, and it is the foundation of your culture, right? All right. Let's talk about values, okay? Because values is obviously the other backdrop of a strong culture, right? Here are a couple of elements to note about values and a couple of examples of values, right? So, there are companies, for example, that have radical candor as a value, right? There are a couple of things to keep in mind about values. First, your company should never have more than 4 or 5 core values. What happens if we have 8, 9, 10, 12 core values? And you can put your answer in the chat. What happens if we have too many core values? What's the result of that? That's not a rhetorical question. Yes, Adriana.
It's hard to create a plan to follow the alignment of the company and the people who integrate the company with that values. It's easy if you have 4 or 5 values to be compliant with during all the organization. Every step, every action, every plan that you create is easy to follow.
Exactly. It's easier to have a plan, right? It's easier to be compliant. Exactly. Right. And a couple other people chimed in here as well. Leslie said they lose importance, right? That's true. The more values we have, the more people are like, well, we got justice and we got this, and we got growth mindset, and we got, and we got saving the planet. And like, which one do I prioritize? Which one's more important? Right. And Juan talked about confusion, right? That's also true. Like when we have all these values, sometimes it's like, wait, was it justice? Was it fairness? Was it this? Was it that? People get easily confused, and people don't have the ability to remember a lot of these different things, right? So, Eladio, you're absolutely right. It becomes difficult to track and difficult to be accountable for how we're delivering on those values, right? So the key thing to remember about values is less is more. You don't need more than 4 or 5 core values in your company. What you need is you need to have very clear values. And then what you need to do is you need to define what those values mean. Because if I tell Juan, if I say, Juan, one of our values at, Mork Incorporated is integrity. Well, that's wonderful, but Juan might have a very different interpretation of integrity than I do. Juan might think, oh, integrity is, not stealing and not cheating and not lying, which is true. But I might have a more strict interpretation of integrity. I might say integrity means that you need to honor your word. And in my company, that means that if you say you're going to show up at 9 a.m. for a meeting, you will be there at 9 a.m. in a meeting. You see the difference? So when we have core values, we need to spend some time and define what those mean. And when we talk about defining what we mean, we're not just talking about the definition of the word, of the value. We're also talking about what does that mean in terms of expected behavior, right? If I say integrity is important, which means we need to be on time, we need to honor our word. When we fail to honor our word, we need to renegotiate with the other party. And as a leader, as a CEO, I am showing up late to meetings. What happens? What's the impact on employees when, as the founder, I am not honoring the values that I say are so important for the business? What's the impact on the people around us? Leave your messages in the chat. Yeah, absolutely. 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 Right. Rafael says, you know, you lose credibility. Absolutely true. Right. Adriana says, you know, complaints and lost talent. That's true. People are like, well, wait, he said we need to talk, we need to always show up on time, and then he's late, right? So there's a disconnect there, right? And I just talks about nobody's going to care about their values. Of course. If the founder doesn't care, if the founder says we're supposed to be innovative, but then, you know, when somebody proposes a really innovative idea, they don't want to go there, then, you know, there's no leadership, right? We're not honoring, we're not being consistent, right? So the thing to keep in mind about values is less is more, 4 or 5 core values. Define each one of your core values in 2 or 3 sentences, and then take a little bit of time to explain to people and hopefully document this in a Google Doc, in Notion, or wherever, what that means in terms of expected behavior. Okay. Now, let me give you an example of how that translates into practice. Okay, so that you can kind of start crystallizing this for your own business. When I was at a startup in Silicon Valley in the educational technology space, one of the values that we had as a business was think like an owner. And think like an owner meant that the expectation of the leadership was that people were proactive, people would manage the budget as if it was their own, people would take on initiative to solve problems with minimal guidance, and that people would be accountable for the end result of what they were working on. In practice, how did this translate? In practice, the engineering team decided to create a series of Slack icons so that people could actually type those icons in the Slack channels whenever they would see behavior by a fellow colleague that supported growth mindset. So we were constantly reminded of the values every day while we were working. Somebody would say something or do something, they'd be like, yeah, hey, we had this problem with the servers, but I took care of it, and now it's all fine, and, you know, I stayed up till 3 a.m., and, you know, I took the server home with me because it was a problem. And all of a sudden, you know, people would be like, they would type in, oh, that's awesome, you know, great example, growth mindset, and they put the little icon, right? And so that's the other component of your values is once you have them defined and you agree on the expected behavior, you have to be constantly reinforcing the behavior in the day-to-day actions of your team and recognizing the people who live the values and pointing them out and saying, hey, Radio, that's great, man. I love how you did that the other day. That's a great example of growth mindset. You know, kudos to you. And, you know, Rafael, I love how you did it. You know, even though it didn't work out, you know, you still kind of like had a growth mindset of going out, stepping out of your comfort zone, trying something, even though it didn't work out. Right? So part of our job as founders, and this is one of the reasons being a founder is so hard, is that you are the owner of the culture. This is not the job of human resources. This is not the job of your C-suite. This is not the job of your people. This is your job. It starts at the top. I cannot emphasize that enough. If you do not embody the values of your company, people will not follow. And I've seen this time and time and time and time and time again. That's one of the hardest things about being a founder is you're the role model. The actions that you take will be imitated and mimicked by everybody else. You live up to the values, people will be incentivized to follow you. If you don't, they won't. Okay. So we talked a little bit about, you know, how as founders we cast the longest shadow. So what's the next step for you? Because as you will hear from me in this boot camp, and this is also because of my background as a founder, this is because of my background as a coach, coaching founders, I am extremely oriented towards action. Like one of my values is a bias to action. So what does this mean in terms of one of the things that you should do coming out of this boot camp today? Sit down and define your top 5 core values. Okay. Figure out what those values are. How do I do that? Because this is not easy, but I have a tool that will make it a hell of a lot easier. Okay. If you go to a website called thinktoperform/values, actually it's thinktoperform.com. I left the .com out of that. thinktoperform.com/values, you will find a very handy tool, which is called the value cards exercise. It's a very simple tool. It'll take you about 20 minutes. And what you can do is you can use that tool to identify your own values as an individual and as a leader. Yeah, that's the link. Thank you. Once you complete that exercise, you will have your 5 core values as a person and as a leader. Then it's up to you to decide which one of my values, as Leslie, as Juan, as Eradio, as Patricia, as Adriana, which one of my 5 core values is so important to me that I believe it should be part of my business. Oftentimes, the purpose of the founder and the values of the founder become the culture of the company. Not always, and it's not always a perfect overlap, but oftentimes that's where your values and purpose come from. It come from you as a founder. So when you take the time to go through that exercise, find out your five core values, 2 things are going to happen. First, you might just be surprised to find that, wow, I didn't realize that, my value around, health and well-being was actually more important than my value around money, right? The think to perform exercise is going to force you to choose. Because you start with 25 values, then you go to 10, then you narrow it down to 5. So you will have to choose which are really the most important values that drive your life. And from there, you choose, okay, which one of these values is so important to me as a person that actually I believe they should be part of my company. Okay. Once you've defined the values that belong to your company, then of course you're going to want to socialize this with your co-founders, right? This is not a decision that you should make unilaterally unless you're a sole founder. If you're a sole founder, you can make the decision unilaterally. In my case, in my last startup, I actually chose to involve the rest of my team. At the beginning, we were a small team, we're only 5 people. So I came to them and I said, hey guys, here are 5 core values that I think are really important. Here's how I define those. And then we had a brainstorm and we had a discussion. And actually, we ended up making some changes. We ended up swapping some values for others because we thought they were so important, right? So some examples of values that we had in my last company. One was justice. We had a very strong sense of justice, and we felt that leadership was something that needed to be taught, not just at the executive level, but across the company. We felt that all people had the ability and had the potential and had the right to lead in certain circumstances, okay? And that affected how we treated each other, and that affected the decisions that we made. Another value that we had was growth mindset, right? So we wanted people at the company to have a growth mindset. We wanted them to really think about, how am I constantly growing? And when we define growth mindset, we didn't just talk about continuous growth and learning, but we also define growth mindset as your ability and your willingness to step out of your comfort zone, do something that's new and that's difficult to you, even if you're going to fail. Now, question to you guys. Why is it important to encourage and tolerate failure in a startup? Answer in the chat. Why is that important? Right. So people won't play it safe. Very good. Because part of the journey is at the beginning. Sure. Yeah, good point, Leslie. It makes you resilient. Exactly. Right. That is one of the most important things. And, one of the most important attributes in a startup is resilience. Right. You have to have this ability to bounce back and bounce back stronger. Right. And so when you have resilience, when you encourage people not to play it safe and to try new things, 2 things happen. The first thing that happens is that people are going to go out and they're going to try stuff that's innovative. And, as a startup, that's the lifeblood of your company. It's innovation. You have to be willing to step out of your comfort zone and do things that are hard, right? So having the capacity to try and fail is vital, okay? Mercy says, so momentum doesn't stop and it's an opportunity to learn. Exactly, right? So when we don't have a growth mindset, sometimes we just stall. Like things get very repetitive, they get very process oriented. We're not actually iterating, right? And especially when you talk about product market fit, one of the things that is a struggle sometimes is we get to a point where the product is good enough, it's monetizing, but we're not doing enough to diversify and to continue to improve it, right? The other thing that you find is that sometimes it's actually the pivots that actually turn into the real business. How many people have heard this story basically, or have heard a story of a startup that goes in a particular direction, and that's the focus of their business, and all of a sudden they make a small adjustment and pivot in something that seems minor, but it ends up being the main business? Raise your hand if you've heard a story like that, right? We've all heard stories like that. How many people here use Slack? Raise your hands. Anybody use Slack? Okay, a couple of people. Do you guys know the origins of Slack, where it came from, what their original business was? Anybody know? Slack was originally a video games company. They made video games for mobile phones. And I know this because back in the day, that's why I have so much gray hair, I worked in the mobile games business, okay? I worked in the mobile games business before the iPhone. That's how old I am, okay? It's hard to believe there was a world before iPhones and app stores, but I was in that world. And we were making video games on J2ME, on Java phones, right? Nokia and all these other phones that ran on Java. And Slack originally was making video games. And they were really struggling because the video game business is hard. And they made game after game after game after game after game. And it was not working. And they were really struggling. But they built one really, really good thing in their video games. And that was a messaging communication solution. They built a really good in-game messaging solution. As a matter of fact, the in-game messaging solution was so robust, it was so fast, it was so good that it was actually better than the games themselves. And at some point in Slack's history, as they were really struggling and they were running out of cash, they're like, okay, what are we really good at doing? Well, we seem to be really good at this messaging thing. I mean, this messaging thing is actually building community within the games, but we're not getting enough people to buy the games and to do in-app purchases. And so they decided what would be possible if, we built a messaging service for enterprise, because they realized that enterprises had a need for messaging, but the problem was security, right? And so any of you guys who use WhatsApp for Business is great. It's relatively secure, but it's not very user-friendly if you're running a company, right? Because once you start having bigger teams, you don't have like all the channels and everything else, and it becomes very, very difficult. Yes, exactly. I remember New Coke because I was at Pepsi at the time. so yeah, New Coke was one of these kind of like crazy pivots, right? But that's a different story with a fun ending as well. So they end up starting to make this messaging service. They make it for the enterprise. They have this mindset on constantly trying new things and innovating. And the end result is they were able to build, one of the world's best enterprise messaging solutions. And eventually, if I remember correctly, they were acquired by Microsoft. Okay. So, when you have a company where the culture is around trying new things, rewarding and encouraging people to step out of their comfort zones, tolerating failure, and openly having discussions around that, you create a certain kind of culture, okay? Now, remember that I talked a couple of slides ago about objectives and key results, right? I want to go back to that slide for a second because I want to share something with you that I think might be helpful. When you look at objectives and key results, anybody here use OKRs as a framework for setting goals in your company? Raise your hand. Anybody use OKRs right now? Juan. Okay. Juan, kudos to you. You're ahead of your peers here. Okay. This is exactly what you want to be doing. And for those of you who are not using OKRs, I would seriously consider researching this and looking at the framework. There's a wonderful book on this called Measure What Matters. It's written by a very, very famous Silicon Valley investor who was at Kleiner Perkins, who before that was at Intel, and he's the one who popularized OKRs. OKRs is a system of setting goals, okay? And I'm not going to go into a ton of detail because there's a lot of information online. There's a lot of videos about this, but I do encourage you guys to check it out. Because the reason why OKRs are so fundamental is not only is it a very good goal-setting framework, but that when you adopt objectives and key results as a goal-setting framework, it changes the culture of your company. Why does it do that? Because OKRs as a goal-setting framework encourages, for example, a lot of transparency. And transparency is the lifeblood of a good company. Like when you have companies where there is a lot of transparency, you get better communication, you get better accountability. Okay, so that's one of the things that OKRs do is they promote transparency, and that begins to shift the culture of your company. They also promote accountability. When you're using OKRs as a goal-setting framework, and you combine that with project management tools like Monday or Trello or Asana or any of these other tools, then it's very clear who owns which project, who has which KPI, and how tasks ladder up to individual projects, which ladder up to company goals. Okay? So again, it becomes very clear who's responsible if they made their deadline or not. And it also becomes very clear when people are not delivering. There's no place to hide. So using tools like OKRs, that can help shift your culture. That can help take you to a place where all of a sudden your culture all of a sudden takes on a life of its own, because you're using a framework that encourages and drives people to behave and operate in a certain way. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. So, getting back to blueprints for this. So one of the things that we're going to do, because we've got, a fair amount of time for this block of the session, is I want you guys to go to Think to Perform. Okay, I want you guys to click on the link, and I want you guys to take, probably going to take you 10 minutes or so. Take 10 minutes to actually do the value cards exercise on thinktoperform.com. I think that's going to be very helpful for you. And then kind of what we can do is, once you have finished that, you can start to define some of those values, and then we're going to leave a little bit of time before the break to discuss a little bit what you found by doing the exercise. Okay? So we're going to take 10 minutes, click on the link, and start to kind of like go through the exercise and figure out what your five core values are. All right? If you have any questions, you can ping me on the chat, but that's going to be the first step. We're going to take 10 minutes to do that. Then I'm going to have people kind of present and share. If you're comfortable with doing that, share some of your values, share what you found and some surprises. And then what you're going to take away from that as the homework after the boot camp is to take those values away and actually think about which ones apply to your company and how to define them. So go ahead and start that, and we will talk in 10 minutes. If you need something, I'm here on the chat, and you can just send me a message.
Can everyone find it in the chat, or is anybody having any issues?
We have it. Thank you.
Awesome.
Great.
For those of you that just joined, I saw there's a couple of you. There's a link in the chat that I'm going to reshare in case you cannot see it. It's basically a questionnaire that you can do, and everyone's asked to do it. Take a few minutes to do it, and then we'll reconvene.
How's everybody doing? How many people have finished? Raise your hand if you finished. Okay, we still have a couple of people going, so we're going to give them a couple more minutes. Yeah, if you have your values already done and you want to share them in the chat, then go ahead and do that. It's completely optional, but if you want to share those are great. Thank you so much, Alejandra, for sharing that. Very cool. Thank you for sharing that, Leslie. Creativity, education, helping others, flexibility, excellence. Thank you, Eradio, for sharing yours.
I try not to think too much. I try to do it as quickly as possible. I think that's a better intuitive way of.
Yeah,
I would like to do it again.
Generally, your intuition will tell you, and your intuition is generally right? The first value, which is the one that pops up, is oftentimes the right one.
Okay.
But it's a very interesting process. We sometimes discover things that we didn't know about ourselves. Thank you, Mariela.
Mariela, that's exactly you.
Patrick, I have a question because I add innovation and resilience, and those were not there, but those are my values. I already have. So.
That's okay. I mean, the tool's not perfect, unfortunately. My values, I have good father, tranquility, mad Mork, and century ride, and I can guarantee you none of those values are in the exercise.
Okay.
So it's not a perfect tool, right? It's orientative, but sometimes we're going to have values that effectively are not there. And you may have something which is a personal value which matters to you. Like, for example, I have a value which is the good father, right? So I have to be very present for my kids. I have to prioritize my children above all else. There's a similar value in there around family, but it's not exactly the same. So sometimes what you'll find is you will want to actually craft a value for yourself like you did, right? So Adrian, you have achievement. I guess that achievement was not in there as a value?
Yes, it was.
It was. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would have been surprised. So we got about 1.5 minutes left to wrap up, okay? Because I want to make sure that we get some discussion, and I also want to make sure to give you guys like 10 or 15 minutes just to ask questions in general about culture, because culture is a big, very vague, amorphous theme. So I'm sure there will be lots of questions, right? And I always say there's no such thing as stupid questions. There's only stupid people who don't ask questions. That's particularly important for founders because we have 1 million questions, right? All right, Rafael, happiness, faith, friendship, loyalty, and health. Great. Adriana's got cooperation, integrity, competence, loyalty, and achievement. Very cool. All right, so like, who are we missing? Who's still working? Patricia's still working. Okay, no worries. And Juan as well. No, this is not easy. It's not easy. And what you'll also find is if you do this exercise every 4 or 5 years, what do you think you're going to discover? What do you think happens when you do this exercise every 4 or 5 years?
Stays the same?
No, I guess
that's-
it changed.
that-
I guess it will change.
Sometimes, yes, Mariela, sometimes it can change, right? Because we go through, like all of a sudden we get divorced. And so one of our values changes. Or all of a sudden we have kids. Or all of a sudden we lose somebody very close to us. Or we lose our jobs. Or something in our life changes, right? So values are not
something happened in
static.
the world. What about something happened in your environment? I don't know.
Exactly.
Politics.
You know,
Yeah,
they elect a certain.
That happened to me, Patrick. I get a cancer. So after cancer, now spirituality is my #1 value.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's the point, right? Is values do change over time. You know, my good father value happened to me after my wife left me and my life completely cratered and I lost my job. And all of a sudden I realized that, all this effort I'd been putting into startups and working, I was at risk of losing my relationship with my children, right? And that's why all of a sudden I made this pivot and I was like, the kids have got to be the focus. I've got to be there for them. I've got to be the best father possible. And that changed me as a person. It forced me to make certain decisions. Okay. So we're at time. So who wants to kind of like volunteer and share what they found during this exercise and if they had any surprises or insights? Who would like to go first? No one?
Don't be shy.
I can go.
go.
I think it was interesting as I was looking at the values. I think I was doing the double exercise on like, what are the values for myself and what are the values for the business that I'm creating? And what is the distinction there between what is it for my personal values that I want to translate into my company? And then what is the distinction, right? So it was interesting to separate both things. And at the same time, how there is a little bit of me that I can put in my business, but at the same time, the business is giving me the opportunity to nurture, cultivate, and even expand in other values that maybe doesn't necessarily be in my daily personal life, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, again, there's often an overlap, but there doesn't have to be an exact overlap, right? Who else? Thank you for sharing. Adriana.
Yes, I was thinking during the exercise, what are the values that allow me to work with others, because sometimes you work in different, at least I have I created another company that was big, and now starting a company again, I was reflecting what kind of values allow me to have a company and grow and have international expansion and achievements and things like that. Because I would like to, for sure, I want to have a work that give you the sense of that you are going for your goals. But at the end, I assuming that right now I'm doing that.
Right. Thank you. No, thank you for sharing. Absolutely. You know, and it's kind of like what we want for the world sometimes is kind of a reflection of our company values, of our personal values as well, right? One of your values is cooperation, right? Can you share with us a little bit why cooperation is so important for you?
Yes, because if you want to create a team of excel, you need to be a good team player too. You can be the leader, but you need to play with the team that allow you to cooperation, give space to others to bring your creativity, win-win ideas and things like that. Is happiness in work is that you allow others that and allow you to work together in the same goals.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, right? And you know, there's an African proverb that I love, which is very applicable to startups, which is if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go with a team. Right? It is much harder to get people to cooperate and work together, particularly when you have very, very different personalities and you have conflicts, but ultimately you will go much farther, right? And so the biggest challenge sometimes entrepreneurs have is, you know, raise your hand if the biggest challenge that you had as an entrepreneur was hiring your first employee. How many people had that challenge? Your first employee, your first hire.
Yeah,
We all have that challenge, right? It's
yes,
scary
yes.
as hell. You're like, holy shit, I have a person on payroll. I need to pay this person. I'm responsible for this person. But oftentimes, the other feeling that you get when you get that first employee, if they're good, is all of a sudden things start to happen. Right? Things just start to happen. It's like I remember when I hired my first salesperson in my first startup, man, I had never hired a salesperson. I had no idea how to manage a salesperson. And all of a sudden, like the first month, the guy wasn't selling. And I was like, oh my God, what do I do? Right. So I kind of like looked at my values and I was like, okay, you know, we got growth mindset. We got to be bold, but I got to be fair, you know? So what did I do? I invested in coaching for this person. I was a startup and I bought coaching for this guy to coach him through the process because I was worried that, you know, he wasn't telling me everything that I needed to know. Right. But my value around growth mindset and my value around justice were like, you know, growth is hard, learning this business is hard, and I got to be fair. I got to give this person a chance, so I have to invest in them. And it turned out to be a very good decision, right? By investing and by being patient and giving the person a chance, they were able to make a success. And this guy brought Walmart, eventually became one of our clients, thanks to this young man. All right. Anybody else? Who else wants to share any insights? What did you find during your value? Anyone else want to share?
Right.
Heradio, go for it.
Yeah.
Well, and Victoria afterwards.
Thank you. As I told you, my first value is because of the cancer surviving. So that's why I changed everything. And I want people in my company to feel this spirituality, because at the end, you have to grow from the inside out.
Yes.
But then excellence, you have to do everything with excellence, but try to helping others all the time. So you help others, you help yourself.
Exactly.
To do something meaningful for the world through happiness, because if you don't have happiness in your company, you know, it's going to be a mess, burnout, everybody going to be, you know, so tired of others. So if you have happiness, you can be creative, you can do a lot of stuff.
Yeah, those are great. I love those, by the way. Those are great values. Have you openly shared those values with the rest of your team?
No, that's the first time that I do this exercise. So,
okay, all right.
Thank you.
So that's my next question, right? And look, when we go into the hiring and the talent part, which is the second part of this boot camp, you're going to see how we connect values and culture to hiring and teams.
Yeah, that's
right. Perfect. You cannot, and I will be brutally honest with you. You cannot have high performance teams if you don't have clear values and clear culture in your company. It is not possible.
Yeah.
All right. This is why there are so many problems in the world today. Gallup estimates that 70% of employees at work today are disengaged. 70 of the world's population that's working is disengaged. It's crazy numbers, right? If you think of all of the problems that we have in the world, all the challenges that we have in the world, that's why kind of like values and purpose are so important, because they are the way to engage your employees. The stronger you live this in your company, the more engaged your people are going to be. Okay. Anybody else? Who else wants to share? Victoria, I think you were next.
No, so I think I did it wrong because I didn't think through myself as a personal lens. I thought through of it through my company.
That's okay.
So yeah, I had integrity, innovation, inclusion, community, and meaningful work. I run a nonprofit, so it tracks.
Okay. And that's fine. How do those company values align with your own personal values?
Well, they do. I mean, I switched from cybersecurity, which is what I used to work on, into the nonprofit world.
Okay.
So because inclusion was important to me, I was one of 3 women in the whole floor at my company.
Right.
So I experienced all of that, and that's what led me to another company that was called Girls in Tech. And I worked there as a program manager, and later, when it shut down, I decided to open my own nonprofit to continue the mission. So I think it's ingrained in me for sure. Integrity has always been important to me as well. And innovation, because we want to make sure that it's not just for women. We say women and allies because I think that we need allies in order to, help everybody, go and rise and everything. So yeah. And of course, it's meaningful work, and we cannot do it without community either, right? Because if we don't have a community supporting us, whether it's partners or the actual community that we're building, because it is for them that we're building it, then none of it works out. So, so I guess it all tracks. Yeah.
No, but it's great because definitely, in your previous experience, this idea of inclusion and this idea of meaningful work, like that was something that you identified was important to you, right? And so now as you created your new company, your new nonprofit, that then becomes a fundamental part of the culture of your new nonprofit, right? So they are directly connected. And that's why going through this exercise and you guys as founders becoming self-aware of your values, that is the first step to actually creating really good cultures in your company.
It's funny because, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say it's funny because from all of the ones that I got, 3 of them are already our values in our website. And it's funny because we wanted it to make sure there was alliteration, so we called it our 5 eyes of change.
Cool.
And that's why it was inclusion, innovation, integrity, influence, and individuality. So it was funny to me that they popped up in this exercise as well.
Yeah, look, I love that. I love that. Like the 5 eyes of change. The other thing that I love about the way you've structured that is that it's very easy to remember. Right? And so kind of like as a founder, you want to keep things simple when it comes to culture. You want to make it as simple as possible because that's how people remember it. That's how people decide to behave in accordance with those values. That's how people recognize it in others, right? That's how it stays top of mind, right? So the key thing when you have these values is create programs that bring these values to life, right? I was talking about the Slack example with the emojis for the different values. That's one example. What other examples could you guys think of that you can implement in your own companies to bring these values to life? Any ideas, any suggestions on how do I bring these values to life in my company? Any ideas?
With example?
Yes. Tell us more.
So, I mean, like, if you say that the company's value is honesty, you are the first one that needs to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, being honest and saying, hey guys, I promised you that the Series A would be done by July, because of the market conditions and because, we've had some issues on the product and we've had some slips. Realistically, I don't see this happening until, mid-September. Right? Mm-hmm. One of the biggest things people are a lot more resilient to bad news than you think as founders. But there is a tendency as founders to hide certain information from them. Your willingness or your decision to share information and be transparent will have a direct consequence on your culture and will therefore have a direct consequence on your ability to retain people and to keep them motivated and inspired. One of the things that I loved about working at Google in the very early days was Sergey and Larry were incredibly transparent. They would share things with us that I would walk out of these meetings and I'd be like, I can't believe they just shared, that this is happening. And they would share it with like 60,000 employees. Now, unfortunately, they don't do it anymore. They've stopped. For years now, they don't have the TGIFs anymore. They don't share things because they were leaked. The culture of the company changed. And between us here, and I wrote a very public post on this, and I was interviewed for Business Insider, that is the reason Google is behind in artificial intelligence. I shit you not. I am not exaggerating. They are behind in AI because their culture is not what it used to be. And people are scared of innovating because they are scared they're going to lose their jobs. And the minute you stop innovating in a company, if you work in tech, what happens?
You die.
You die. And the question of how fast you die is a question of how much resource you have and how big you are. Okay, so for Google, it will take a lot longer. But man, I got to tell you, I don't know the last time I used Google search. I live on ChatGPT, Turbo and the other AI tools, and the more I use Google tools, the more problems I feel I have.
What I say is that it's good to use Google to look for an address or for a telephone number, things like that.
Sure. But
I love Notebook LM.
Notebook's awesome. I agree. I 100% agree. I mean, I uploaded my entire book to Notebook LM, and the podcast that came out of my book through Notebook LM was amazing. It was accurate. It was fun to listen to, and I was blown away. But, the question is, from a business point of view, how do they monetize that, right? And can it replace the business that they've lost? Yeah, somebody just posted, I think that's Google's share price. You don't have to tell me I sold the stock about 8 weeks ago. I got out. Okay.
I think Aurora has her hand up.
Oh, sure. Aurora, sorry, go ahead.
No, you're fine. Thank you. I was in that conversation where that you're saying right now, as at the beginning, it's easy, right? When you have a small team, and it's easy because you as the founder, you are present in the day-to-day operations and they can see you and you are leading from example. But in that process where the companies start scaling, and then you having like multiple teams, and you are not maybe present with every single one in there, right? And yes, you can have an internal communication strategy to communicate your values, and you have content, and then you can tell them how to put those values in practice. But as you scale, how can you make sure that those values stay, that the culture stays present? And I think it has to do with the founder and the leadership team. But again, as you scale, as you're saying, things change rapidly. Context around us change very rapidly. So what advice would you give, not only for the company, but for that founder? I don't know if you see where my question is kind of going.
I totally see your question, and it's a fantastic question. Okay. It is a question that most founders who scale, who get to Series B, do not pay enough attention to until it becomes a problem, right? I can't tell you the number of founders who hit Series B who then come to me and be like, okay, now we got to change the culture. And I'm like, bro, it's too late. It's much harder, right? So think of it like a ship. The bigger the ship gets, the harder it is to change direction and change culture, right? So you have to set the foundation for the culture early, okay? One of the most important things that you guys can do coming out of the meeting today, which is an action item, is go onto Google, because Google is still useful for some things, or use Perplexity, because I know that Victoria uses Perplexity. Personally, I love Perplexity, okay? Use Perplexity or use Google and find culture decks from the best companies in the world. They are online, okay? Netflix, Airbnb, GitHub, HubSpot, all these companies have publicly made available their culture decks online. You can download them. Read through those culture decks and start to build your own culture deck, okay? You may be surprised, but when I started my last company, Leap, in Chile in 2018, the first thing I did was not write the business plan or the business model. The first thing I did was I created the culture deck. I created the culture deck before I created the business. And I wrote down basically, what's our purpose? You know, what's going to be the mission of this company? What are going to be the values of this company? What do we stand for? What's our mission statement? You know, what's our brand essence? I spent a lot of time building this deck. Okay. And I built a culture deck. And when you onboard a new employee, one of the first things that you do is you take them through the culture deck. And so the answer to your question, Aurora, about how you scale as your company grows, how do you scale culture? There's a couple of answers, and we're going to talk about this a lot in the next section. Okay. The first thing is that you have to slow down and you have to hire less quickly. And I know this sounds completely counterintuitive because the VCs will tell you the exact opposite, and they are wrong. And they can afford to be wrong because they're betting on 10 or 20 companies and you're betting on one. Okay. You have to slow down your hiring because you have to make sure that when you're hiring for fit and not for skills. That's critical. You don't hire a good engineer because he can do the job. You hire a good engineer because he can do the job and he's a good culture fit. As a matter of fact, if he is a really good culture fit, but he's slightly less good as an engineer compared to another guy who's a better engineer, but is not a culture fit, you hire that person. You always hire character over skills. That is a sacred rule, and you must not break it. If you break the rule, you will pay the results. I guarantee you. I've broken the rule before. It never works out. Okay. And I cannot tell you the number of companies that I come in contact with where they're like, oh man, we have this amazing head of sales. And the numbers are great and the team absolutely freaking hates him and he's toxic. Happens all the time. All the time. And believe me, you guys all know the story of, you know, the one rotten apple that contaminates the rest. This is so true in startups where you make that mistake with talent. You can make one bad hire who is technically awesome and will poison your culture. Okay, so as you scale, you are basically hiring brand ambassadors and culture ambassadors. So you want to make sure that you have different people in different parts of the organization who are the ambassadors of your culture, who represent your culture in finance, in human resources, in sales, in marketing, in customer success. And those are the people that drive your culture, right? And we're going to talk about this a lot in the next section. You want to make sure that basically people are hiring based on culture. So when you're hiring, you have a very clear set of questions that you use in the interview process that are tied back to your values. So if one of my values is, let's go back to Victoria, one of my values is meaningful work. What 10 questions do I have that my team has access to that we use in our interview process to make sure that the person that we're talking to values meaningful work as much as we do? If we come across a candidate who is awesome, but just wants to make money and doesn't give a damn about what's the meaning of their work, do we hire them or not? And this is where most people will make the mistake. They will hire them because they will have this sense of urgency that, oh, we got to hit our numbers. We got to get this person. We got to fill this seat. Don't do it. It never works out properly. Okay. The more you fit with your culture, the less you have to worry about it. Let me give you a very real example, and then I'll get back to your question, Leslie. When I was at Leap and our company was about 10 or 15 people, we had to hire a head of digital marketing. And I was really stressed because we really needed this person because like the guy that I had doing marketing was great, but he was doing a million different things and he was not that good in digital marketing. So the hiring process of hiring a digital marketing person. And I'll never forget that, you know, we had this guy, he was very interesting, he had a very interesting background. He spoke very, very well. And I was interviewing him late one night. And I got out of that call and I went to this guy, Jose, who was on my team, who was my first hire. And I was like, man, I thought that guy was pretty good, you know, this and that, you know, we should totally hire him. He's really going to save us. And Jose looks at me and he was speechless. He's like, looked at me like as if I was an alien from another planet. And I go, what's the problem? And he goes, Patrick, are you drunk? And I, what do you mean? What do you mean am I drunk? And he's like, Patrick, we can't hire this person. I was like, why can't we not hire? And he's like, well, he doesn't have a growth mindset. And I was like, well, what makes you say that? And he's like, well, I asked him a bunch of questions and I asked him this, and this to tease about growth mindset. And when I asked him what was the most dangerous thing that he had ever done, his answer was, you know, the day that the Chilean government lifted the COVID restrictions, he had stepped outside his house. That was his definition of risk. And I started laughing, and I was like, oh my God, I totally didn't see it. I, the CEO and the founder of the company, did not see it. And I was about to make a mistake and hire a guy who could do the job technically, but he did not share our value around growth mindset. And that means he was not going to push the envelope in digital marketing. And that was going to affect the rest of the team who worked with him. And Jose saved me, he saved us from making that hire. And so the answer to your question, Aurora, is when you hire people who share your values, they start to enforce the culture for you. That's what happens. They start to do the checking because they believe in it so passionately because you hired them for that. They believe that they're part of the reason the company exists. They are part of the founding team, and they take it so personally that they will protect the culture even when you don't see it. Right? And that's why it's so important to hire slowly and to fire fast. Right? We'll talk about that more in the next section. Leslie, you had a question. These are great questions, by the way. Okay, this is like fire away on all these questions because that's what Q&A is all about.
Thank you. Yeah, it has been incredible. My question is, can you train somebody whose natural personality is not really aligned with your values, but it's a very young person? Can you train it into your values? And my question is because I hired a studio manager a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And she was fantastic. I adore her. Very organized. She was just perfect. It was exactly what I needed. And but she hated clients. And the clients are the blood work of my business.
Yeah.
It was her personality. She was constantly feeling that the clients were abusing us. And I was like, no, that's our customer service values are that to help them to go way above our, you know, not the extra mile, the extra 10 miles, of course, within reason. But I didn't want to get rid of her because in all of the other areas, she was perfect. She was fantastic. She was organized and a fast learner. And she knew a lot more than I did about other things in which I was weak. So I tried to train her, and eventually I broke through some of the things that made her hate her clients. It turns out she was shy. So, but at the end, long story short, she got pregnant and she left. But if she wouldn't have gotten pregnant, is it worth it to invest so much time to try to change her mindset? Is it worth it, or is it better to say, you know what, this is good, but I need somebody who's more client oriented?
It's a very good question, and it's a very real problem. It happened to me as well in one of my companies. Unfortunately, after 2 years, I was forced to let somebody go because of something like this. I let them go. It depends on the person, unfortunately, is the answer, right? So if you think of leadership, right, which is what all of you guys do as founders, what you have to be able to adapt to and do differently with your people is you have to know the difference between motivating and skill development, right? What do I mean by that? Think of it like a 2x2 matrix, okay? And on the one hand, on the vertical axis is the person's level of skill from low to high, okay? On the horizontal axis is the person's level of motivation from low to high, left to right, okay? The best people, obviously, are the ones that are in the upper right quadrant. They are highly skilled and they're highly motivated. Those are the stars, okay?
Unicorns.
Those are the unicorns, exactly. Those are your top performers. Those are the people that will make or break your company, okay? So depending on where your employee is, you as a founder have to adapt differently. If the person is, very motivated but has low skill, what do?
You develop her skills.
Yeah, you train them.
You train them.
You train them,
Education.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You train them, you send them to a course, you buy them an online course, you tell your HR team, if you have one, to get them some books, get them some training, make them better, right? If the person has high skill but low motivation, what do?
You motivate them. I don't know.
You motivate them, right?
Yes.
We call it coaching.
Incentivate them.
Yeah, exactly.
You call it what?
We call it coaching.
Coach.
You
Okay.
coach them, right? What you're trying to figure out, it's like a mixture of coaching and psychology. What you're trying to figure out is exactly what you figured out with this woman, which is, why does she not want to be in front of the customer? And in your case, you found out she didn't want to be in front of the customer, not because she hated the customers, but because she was shy.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean? Again, you'll hear me say this a lot during the boot camp. You need to slow down to figure this stuff out.
Okay.
The biggest thing that kills startups often is speed. We live in a world where we're constantly told that we need to go faster. And in some cases, that's true. But it's not true when it comes to human resources and people. The only way to figure out that a person that is awesome but is not doing the job a certain way, and we need them to change, the only way to figure out what is blocking them is we need to slow down, we need to coach them, and we need to ask a lot of questions to understand why they're not doing the job a certain way.
All right?
This is why one-on-one meetings are sacred. If you are not having one-on-one meetings with every person on your team at least once a week, it is much harder to find out where they are struggling, because you do not have the time to dig deep enough to figure out what's stopping them, right? Because I bet that to help this woman, you probably needed to spend a lot of time with her and ask her a lot of questions until you finally found out she was shy, right?
Yes.
How much time did that take?
Oh my God. I would look at because I would look at the hourly rate that I would pay her.
Yeah.
And it was like, how much of this time that I'm paying her am I investing in training her or trying to figure out her? So it was a very stressful situation for me, because I feel that I was paying her to be her therapist, to figure out why she hated clients.
Yeah.
And to teach her how to be, that was part of our job, to service clients.
Yeah.
So,
but look, I have news for everybody on this call.
What?
Your number one job as founders, if you're going to be successful, is to coach your people.
Okay.
If you are not able to coach and develop your people, your business will really struggle unless you can find somebody else in your organization who can really do that job, right? And so, some people are just not oriented towards developing and coaching. They struggle. They don't have the abilities. They don't have the skill set to do it. Especially people who are, more engineering focused, more finance focused. If you are one of those people, you need to make sure that you have somebody very senior on your team who can do that. Right? Maybe it's your co-founder, maybe it's somebody else on the team, but it's fundamental to be able to find out, how do you coach this person? How do you ask the right questions so you can find out really deep down what's bothering them? And unfortunately, that takes time, it takes a lot of questioning, it takes a lot of patience. Okay.
Thank you.
I think
Mafe Delgado, you have a question.
I think more than a question, I kind of wanted to add something.
Sure.
And it's part of like an experience I had a few years ago. I was at an interview with, Uber, and part of the interview process, and we were doing this to every candidate that was coming through the door, was basically a cultural fit. And that cultural fit conversation was really about kind of like, is this person going to align with the culture of the company? But beyond that, there was basically a test. Can we do something where basically you're trying to get them out of control and how they're really going to react to it?
Yep.
And it was more of like, I could understand, can you explain it again? And you would explain it again, and then the person will ask the same question once and once and once again, because I can also tell you a lot about the other person and how they're going to react to certain situations. And one thing that I have learned throughout all of these years, I have been with companies that have very clear culture, other ones that have not had that much clear culture. It's what you said, like the growth mindset really matters. And as an immigrant myself, I actually talked about this yesterday. I had an opportunity to actually be able to be part of a company that I was very honest with, upfront with, saying, I have no idea what this is about. And literally they were like, do you know anything about tech? And I was like, honestly, I have no idea. I was coming from being a fracking engineer. And and I was like, I honestly have no idea. But if I had to figure out how to be a fracking engineer with a industrial engineering background in a completely different language, I sure can tell you that I can try to learn this and see if I can figure it out. But I cannot tell you anything else. And the reason why I ended up getting the job was because of the growth mindset over the technicality of it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Last,
we have one more question, Aurora. If you want to jump in quickly, and then we can head over for a quick break.
Right.
Last question before the break.
Okay. I have too many, but I'm going to do one for now. I keep the one for later. In that conversation that you're saying, that those one-on-ones, sometimes I find myself with my team, I'm saying that 60-70% of what I do is coaching them, right? And then I have the time, like I have very little time to do the responsibilities and the thing that I have to do in my position. And then there is that inner conversation of like, where is that balance between getting too personal or too professional? Because yes, there is that conversation that you're saying, the value fit, but my team, they're humans and they're going through personal stuff. And in those one-on-ones, I have found a lot of personal situations that are affecting them. And that's the obstacle. So what advice, and like in that position, how personal do we go? How professional do we keep it? Those one-on-one can go different sideways, and also the vision that they can end up having of you, because then they start like depending so much on me on that personal support. And it's like, but we're here to work. So it's kind of like streaky.
It's very, very tricky, Aurora. And look, I hear you, because I had the same thing. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, it's a question of perspective. Personal life and work life are tied together. That's just as founders, that's what we have to accept. We have to accept that people, when we hire them, human beings have personal baggage. That's part of what makes us human. And so what I have found is the best leaders, they make time for that, right? They will ask questions. They'll try to understand, what's happening at home. How's your family? How's your wife? How's your health? They will get involved because that shows that they care, right? That shows that they have empathy. That shows that they realize that, a person's personal situation will affect them at work. Nonetheless, there is a balance, right? There's a fine line for a couple of reasons. First of all, most founders, we are not trained psychologists. We are not trained therapists, right? So if you begin to identify that somebody on your team has a recurring issue, then I think it's your responsibility to tell them in a very gentle and kind way, look, I don't feel that I am qualified to help you sort through this. I think you should seek therapy. I think that you should seek help, right? And depending on the situation, you may want to subsidize that help. I've done it. Like every single employee I had at my last company, and we were a bootstrapped startup, every employee had 6 sessions of coaching, which I paid for. Everyone, as a bootstrap company, okay? And I cannot tell you the value of that, because first of all, the message that it sends to employees when I did it was, I'm invested in their well-being. I give a shit. I want you to be okay, okay? The second message it says is, I'm invested in your growth and your development as a human being, right? I want you to grow and get better, right? And so everybody wins when you do something like that. It feels like, oh my God, I don't have the money to do this. And the question I always have for founders is, do you have the money to lose a valuable employee. Because if they can't find help in their current situation, they will go somewhere else to find it, right? So, you know, as a founder, you want to provide them that space. You want to ask, you want to answer the questions, you want to be there for them. But if you find that, you know, it's like every single week this is happening, the problem is recurring, I think the best thing is to guide them in the direction of a therapist or a professional who can help them. And then you have to make a decision, which is, you know, is this something as a company that I feel I should invest in or not? And that is really your call. But you are, like I always tell people, as the startup founder, you are everybody else's slave. Your employees, your clients, your investors. And the more you get it into your mindset that part of your role is to serve, the more successful your company will be.
That's very true, Patrick. Thank you for this first part of the session. Let's stop here for a quick, I think 10-minute break should work. So feel free to, you know, grab some water, stretch, everything you need, and then we'll be back in around 10 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. Please make your ways back if you're grabbing a coffee as we gear up for the second part of this session with Patrick, and moving on to the hiring and the firing and kind of the people part of the company. As said, guys, I encourage all of you to turn your cameras on and stay muted unless you wanna talk or ask a question. As you know, this session's being recorded and will go on until 12:30. So with that, Patrick, I'll hand over to you to lead this part.
Great. Super. Thank you so much. I'm going to go back to my slides. So now we get into the different part where the rubber hits the road, which is really talking about teams and hiring, right? And I know that there will be a lot of questions. So we stop. I think we have until 12:30. So I'll probably stop around 12:15 or 12:20 to give time for questions, because I know that there will be a lot of questions here. There will also be downloadable materials. So I'll look to upload some things into the chat here. If you're unable to get some of the materials, don't get stressed, because the good news is I have a newsletter, which is weekly and it's free and you can sign up for it. And I talk about all this stuff in my newsletter every week. I think the other thing that I think you guys will find cool is at the end of May, I'm launching a new podcast called Mork Unfiltered, where I'm going to be talking about a lot of this stuff, and I'm going to have guests on the show who will talk about a lot of these things. Okay, so there's a lot more content coming, because I know that so many people struggle with this that I'm absolutely determined to find a way to share more knowledge. So anyway, diving into this next part, talking about right team, right stage, you know, I think one of the things that we have to pay attention to is, depending on the stage of your startup, the profile and the type of people you are going to hire will vary. Okay, now some of this may sound obvious. For those who are serial founders here, you may already know this. For those of you who are first-time founders, you may not know this. So generally speaking, when you're starting with early stage companies, which is the stage at which most of you are right now, you know, you want to hire what's called builders. Okay, you don't want to hire people that are super heavy on process optimization. You don't want to hire people who are like very, very specialized in a certain thing. You want to generally hire people who are generalists and who are kind of like jack of all trades and able to pivot and do a lot of different things. Okay. And the reason for this is that, you know, circumstances in your startup may change. Circumstances in your business may change, right? So if you hire a person that, you know, the only thing they can do in social media is social media, and you don't really have a lot of content for them, then they're not going to have much to do, and you're probably going to have to let them go, right? So generally, you want to have people who are, you know, they're very comfortable with change. They're very comfortable with pivots. They are generalists. They can do multiple different things. And importantly, you want to hire people who have a very high risk for they have a very high tolerance for risk, all right? Because things are going to be changing. And so if you hire people who, you know, they need to have everything very organized and you have to follow certain processes. There are people who are like that. That's just kind of part of their personality. Those people do not adapt well to high-speed kind of like startup culture at the very beginning. It's overwhelming for them. It's too much change. Okay. Those people are much better in much later stages of your company, and you will need those people, right? The question is when, because at the beginning you can over-engineer and you can over-process things, and that will slow you down too much. Okay. When you get to growth stage, then you're looking more for what I call kind of the optimizers. All right. So you do need some process, although you need some degree of flexibility. You're starting to need specialists. Okay. So you, instead of having a sales guy who can do sales calls and customer success and troubleshoot and do marketing collateral, you're going to start having to have specialized people. So you need a person in marketing, you need a person in sales, you need a customer support people. And then you need people who are like, digging more and more into the data, right? And then at the late stage, obviously, this is a good problem to have because it means that you're succeeding, you're scaling. Then, of course, you're starting to look at what I call the sustainers, right? So you're looking at people who, they are excellent at what they do. You have some people that are highly, highly focused on process optimization, people who can come in and put the right process across teams, not just in individual teams, people who are strategic thinkers. But you'll notice that across all three stages, there's one thing which is a constant, right? Which is what we just spent an hour and a half talking about, which is no matter what the stage, you always need to hire people who are aligned with your values and your purpose. Always. Doesn't matter if it's their CFO and your Series C. It doesn't matter if it's like your first sales hire and your seed. Okay. Always make sure that you do not compromise on this stuff. All right. So I want to tell you the quick story of Jose, because as you know, I'm a storyteller and stories are great at illustrating a point. Okay. So I was in Santiago, Chile, right? And so for those of you who don't know, hablo español, viví 10 años en Sudamérica, entonces súper cómodo con la cultura latina. I spent many years in Latin America, and I was in Chile, and I was starting my leadership and development company. And as a sole entrepreneur, there was a lot to do, right? Every single one of you here has been a sole entrepreneur at some point, unless you started with a co-founder, which is ideal, to be honest. And I was struggling because my business was starting to take off. I had a lot of stuff going on. I was super busy and I was doing everything, right? How many of you guys have been in a position, or maybe you're in a position right now where you feel like you're doing everything, right? You're sending the invoices, you're writing your newsletter, you're having sales calls, you're trying to build the product, you're managing people, you're hiring people, you're trying to raise money, you're doing everything, right? And it is overwhelming at times. And I had so much stuff going on, and I had to improve the website. I had to send a newsletter. I was implementing HubSpot, doing sales calls, doing coaching, doing a whole bunch of stuff. And at some point I was talking to, I don't know if it was my dad or one of my advisors, and he's like, dude, you need to bite the bullet. You need to make your first hire, And I was like, oh my God, my first hire, and I'm going to have to commit to a salary and all this other stuff. And so I'm sitting in the office. Well, I was in a co-work. I was at WeWork in Santiago. And behind me, I was in a shared office. There was this young woman from Venezuela, and I was eavesdropping on one of her phone calls. And she was great. She's really smart, really fast, really good conversationalist, very organized. And so one day, being the person that I am, I turned around and I said, "Hey, I need to hire some sort of a social media, newsletter, marketing, video editing generalist." And I was like, you wouldn't happen to have a twin sister or somebody like you who I could hire, right? And she laughed and she's like, no, she's like, I don't have a twin sister, but she's like, my boyfriend, Jose, who lives in Venezuela, is actually looking to move to Santiago and he needs a job. And I was like, hey, great, cool. So I was like, well, look, give me his details and I'll talk to him and let's see where it goes. And so I jump on a call and I have a Google Meets call. This was before COVID. I jump on a Meets call and I interview Jose, and I really like him. He's smart. He asks good questions. He has good energy. He's kind of he's done all sorts of weird things because when you live in Venezuela, you have to do all sorts of weird things to survive, right? So everybody's an entrepreneur in Venezuela. So he's done everything. He's done graphic design. He's done banners. He's mixed cocktails at a local bar. He's done all these things. And I'm like, I really like his energy. But, you know, then I'm thinking about my business and I'm thinking about what I need, right? So I need somebody who's doing email. I need somebody who's doing CRM. I need somebody who's helping me with my website. I need somebody who understands brand. So here's a question to you guys in the audience. How much experience do you think Jose had with content marketing? None. Exactly. Zero. Very exactly, Leslie. So Jose had zero experience with content marketing. How much experience do you think Jose had with, you know, setting up and optimizing CRM solutions?
None.
Zero.
Zero. How much experience do you think Jose had with branding and creating a brand?
It was definitely very Venezuelan. because I guess he was willing to tell you that he was going to do everything.
Exactly. So, you know, you see where the story is going. Jose did not really have the skills that I needed. But remember what I told you in the last section, which is that I had written my culture deck. And so I had very clear in my mind that I had 4 values for Leap. I had boldness, I had growth mindset, I had justice, and I had doing something meaningful for the world, right? Those were the 4 kind of core values of Leap, my company. And as I was interviewing Jose, I was asking him questions to see, well, how bold is this guy? And does he have a growth mindset? And, you know, does he want to do something meaningful or just collect a paycheck? And the more I talked with him, I found that, you know, he really embodied the values that I had written in my culture deck. He had great energy. He was, you know, very tolerant of risk. He was a risk taker. He had done a lot of things. He had struggled in Venezuela to keep him and his family afloat. And so I ended up hiring him. And it was, in my 20 years of managing people, one of the best hires that I've made. And I've hired people at Google. I've hired people in Silicon Valley. I've hired people in London. This kid, because he was a kid when I hired him, ended up being phenomenal. And I spent a lot of time training him. I spent a lot of time investing in teaching him about CRM, teaching him about content marketing, teaching him about branding, teaching him about sales. But he became my champion. I mean, he was a guy that, you know, he was the one that gave me that feedback on that bad hire that I almost made. He was the one that helped me interview and hire Valentin, our first salesperson. He was the one that helped me interview and hire my co-founder, because I did eventually get a co-founder. He was the one that ended up owning our newsletter and grew it to over 3,000 subscribers with next to no money. He helped me edit and produce over 70 leadership videos, which are all available on my YouTube channel in Spanish. He and I edited and created 70 videos on leadership. You know, and he built this. We would film every week in my house for a couple of hours. We would film these videos in Spanish, which ended up being a big part of our marketing. He helped us build, you know, our sales and marketing process. He helped me build the website. He helped start running our first ad campaigns to promote our newsletter, to promote our videos, to promote all this content. And in 4 years working with Jose, you know, we did some incredible things. We impacted over 10,000 leaders across Latin America. We built a library of 70 plus videos that had millions of views. You know, we ended up having like, you know, 8,000 or 9,000 subscribers. You know, we did these fantastic ad campaigns as a leadership development company. We got, you know, the company into the press. We were featured in newspapers. And a large part of the success that we had as a company, while it lasted, unfortunately, that company did not make it for other reasons. But a large part of the success we had in this company was due to this young guy, right? And so the point is kind of like what we're going to talk about now is how do you hire for character as opposed to hiring for skills, right? That's really the whole point of why I'm sharing this story with you, all right? I would never have been able to do the stuff that I did in this company without Jose, right? And so when you look at skills versus character, skills is really, it's a temporary advantage. Yes, you will meet people who are more skilled than others, okay? But skills is something that you can teach, right? When you think about stuff like grit and resilience, that is much harder to teach. When I interviewed Jose, when I heard from him the stories that he had been through in Venezuela, they would steal the antenna of his internet from his house the day before he had to deliver a project to a client in another country. I mean, To us in America, it is inconceivable that we don't have internet because somebody steals our antenna. But in Venezuela, this happens every day, right? And so when I heard stories like that, I was like, man, this guy, if I motivate him and I train him, he will walk through fire for me, for this company. And as a matter of fact, even though the company did go bankrupt, Jose was with me until the end, right? Those are the kind of employees that you want to hire. And so the question is, how do we find them? Okay. Skills are constantly evolving, right? So you need to be working and improving your skills all the time. That takes a certain kind of person. Not everybody is oriented towards that. How many people have worked with somebody who like is pretty good at something, but refuses to grow and do things differently? Raise your hands, right? Fixed mindset. We've all come across people like that. They're like, oh no, but I'm going to continue doing it this way because this is what's always worked for me, even though the market's completely changing, right? When you look at people who are, you know, who feel like they have a sense of ownership, they will go the extra mile. I remember that Jose would sometimes come to me and he would sometimes say, no, Patrick, we're not ready to launch this campaign. And I'd be like, why? And he's like, because I'm not happy with the landing page. It's not good enough. This was an employee telling me this as the founder, right? When you have people who care to that extent, who care almost as much about your company and your product as you do, that's how you know you've made the right people, right? Skills are replaceable assets. Skills come and go, they change, right? But one of the most powerful traits that you can hire for is curiosity, right? When people are curious, and Jose was curious, they are constantly thinking about how to bring value to your business, right? Somebody once said, I love hiring lazy people because they're so lazy, they're always going to find a way to do things faster and more easily. There is some truth to that. I wouldn't say I agree 100%, but there is some truth to that, right? Those people who are curious especially are always looking for, oh, I found this new tool. And guess what? I don't need to do, LinkedIn outreach directly anymore because there's an AI tool that will automatically reach out to 10 people every day and ask for a connection and then send the next 5 messages. Those are the people that you love, the people that are constantly coming up with new ideas, right? So people grow and develop, right? And the skills, those are replaceable, right? So you can train for skill. You can't train for character. It's much, much harder, okay? So let's go back to connecting values with recruiting, okay? This is like the magic moment. Dun, dun, dun. This is what everybody's been waiting for. I know, don't jump up and down, get too excited, all right? But let's go back to our values for a second, all right? And so let's kind of, we are survivors. Yes, we are. Yes, we are, Leslie, absolutely. Let's look at the left-hand column, okay? And let's assume that these are the values of our company. And again, your values will be different. You have different values, but we have integrity, ownership, curiosity, and resilience, okay? So if we look at, for example, curiosity, and we want to interview, we want to find out if a candidate has curiosity, we can ask a question like, what have you taught yourself in the past year? What's been the book or course that's been the most impactful on you? What is one class that you have chosen that's really surprised you and made you a better person? Okay, so once we've established our values, our 5 core values, and we have defined those values in 2 or 3 sentences, then the next step is we need to take those values over to our recruiting process. And this is also, guys, why values are so important, because values help you recruit better, right? When you have a list in Google, I learned this at Google. When we interviewed people at Google, and now Gemini is listening into me. I don't need you, Gemini. Thank you. And when I was at Google, one of the things that they teach you is that when you're going through the interview process, they have what's called a tricks, right? Which is basically a Google sheet. And in that tricks, they have a tab for each one of Google's values. And in that tab, they have 20 or 25 different questions that people on the team can ask a candidate to assess whether they are a culture fit for the company. That's how scientific they are about that. And this was 10 years ago. They've probably become far more sophisticated today, right? So what you want to do is you want to have at least 5 to 10 questions written somewhere in a document or in Notion that all of your team has access to, so that when they are interviewing, you and different members of the team can ask questions that specifically tease out the value that's important to your company, right? So going back to curiosity, Jose, what have you taught yourself in the past year? What am I looking for? I'm looking to see if Jose is a self-directed learner. I'm looking to see if Jose is passionate and excited about learning new things and stepping out of his comfort zone, even if that means he's going to fail. Okay? Let's say that, for example, one of my values is learning as failure. Not a very common value, and not a value you're going to find in the exercise that I gave you online. But it's a very powerful value to have in a startup, because when your employees shift their mindset from failure to learning, then they are willing to try things much more often, even if it means they don't succeed, right? Anybody who has watched Michael Jordan or Steph Curry or any of these great, basketball, soccer, whatever athletes, most of the greatest athletes will tell you that the learning actually comes from all the mistakes that they made. They once interviewed Kobe Bryant. How many people here, raise your hands if you know Kobe Bryant? Kobe Bryant, famous Lakers basketball prodigy. So they interviewed Kobe Bryant, and the interviewer, the newscast anchor, she goes, Kobe, tell us what kind of athlete you are. Are you the guy who absolutely, has to win because you hate and fear losing? Or are you the kind of athlete who absolutely has to win because you love winning? And his answer was, I am neither. I am the athlete who goes in and absolutely loves learning. That was his answer. That tells you everything that you need to know about Kobe Bryant, right? And that's the kind of employee that you want to hire. You want to hire people that embody your values. And when you hire people that have that framework, that look at failure as a source of learning, then you make much better hires, right? So in an interview question, you would want to ask something like, what's been the greatest setback that you've ever faced in your professional or personal career? What's one time you set yourself a goal and you really didn't get there, and what did you learn from that? And then the behavior that you're looking for is you want people that are actually excited about sharing that. Who go, well, you know what? I wanted to train and do this marathon, and I never finished it, but I learned all these different things, right? That's kind of what you're doing. So when you're mapping your values to recruiting, that's where you start. You have your defined values. You have a defined set of questions mapped to each value. You ask those in the interview, and you look for very specific behavior that tells you whether that person checks that box or not. And not only do you do that, but the rest of your team does it as well. Okay? How many people have heard of how notoriously difficult Google's recruiting process is? Raise your hands. All right? Google has I don't know if they still have it, but they had a ridiculous recruiting process. They would have you interviewed by like 12 people. When I went to interview to be marketing director for Play, I had like 12 people interview me. It was insane how hard the interview process was. And the reason that they do that is because they have all sorts of people asking you all sorts of different questions, and then they cross-check the answers, right? So it's a very complex process. And so they're asking a lot of questions on values, and they have people asking different questions. And then sometimes they have people asking the same question so that they can see if your answers are consistent. All right, it's all very scientific. So one of the things that is the greatest failure in startups, and this is not just in startups, this happens in companies all around the world. How many people have heard this phrase? Oh, we absolutely have to hire this person. We went to the same school together. They're going to fit in because we all went to Stanford, and they think exactly like us, and they're going to fit just perfectly. How many people have heard this kind of phrase or something in a company before? Raise your hands. Right? Many of us have heard this. This is the absolute worst way to hire. Okay? It's the worst way to hire. Why is it the worst way to hire? If you hire 5 people for your startup that all went to Stanford, they are all going to think like somebody who went to Stanford. And no matter how intelligent that is, The problem with that approach is that it does not give you the best solution to your problems. Exactly, Aurora. The best solution to your problems, especially in a startup, is to have as diverse perspectives as possible. Let me give you an example. When I was at Google, my first team there, right, at Play, I had an Indian guy who had been product manager in India. I had an Italian, super crazy creative person who had been a brand marketer in like Venice. I had an African-American 6'5" guy who had been an investment banker on Wall Street. I had a woman from ad sales who was like half Colombian who had grown up kind of like poor in Puerto Rico. I had a guy who had worked in book publishing who was Jewish who had lived in New York. The one thing that they had in common was they were all very, very smart. They were very, very hardworking, and they shared our values. But apart from that, they were extremely different. Now, the downside is that those are the hardest teams to manage. It is very hard to manage an extremely diverse group. The upside is it makes incredible insight and problem solving. Okay. So when you're hiring, when you're building your teams, one of the things that you want to do is what I call breaking the pedigree trap. It is unbelievable to me how many people get fascinated and obsessed with hiring people just because they went to a top school. Oh, this person went to Harvard, or this person went to MIT, or this person went to INSEAD. I went to, and was fortunate enough to go to some of the best schools in the world, okay, in terms of my education. You know, Georgetown undergrad, I went to INSEAD for business school. It's great. You know, obviously there's some very talented, very smart people. Would I ever hire a team for my next startup that all came from INSEAD or Georgetown? Hell no. Hell no. I might hire one, but that's it, right? Because again, the problem is that when you get people that all kind of think and operate the same way, you get groupthink. People all come to the same conclusions because that's the way they're wired to think, right? And yes, that's true, Leslie. I wouldn't generalize, but oftentimes there is a question of, you know, how emotionally intelligent are they, right? Just because somebody went to a top school, that doesn't mean that they have high emotional intelligence. It probably means that they have very high IQ. But those people do not necessarily make the best managers, especially in a startup, right? So you want to break the pedigree trap, okay? The other thing is that you want to hire people who have very different backgrounds because they have completely different ways of problem solving, right? Some people problem solve by using a whiteboard. Some people problem solve by doing a brainstorm. Some people solve by going for a walk in nature. Some people solve a problem by going home and smoking a joint. Seriously, it doesn't matter how they solve the problem. It matters that they solve the problem. And the more you have a mixture of those different types of people, the better the outcome is going to be for your company. All right. The last thing when you're thinking about your team, okay, is that how many people have been in a situation where they either talk to a founder or talk to a startup, and the message that they get is, oh, our company's great because we never have any conflict. Anybody hear that before? Anybody heard that before? You know, this thing about like conflict is bad. That is like the first sign of danger. Whenever a founder tells me that, when I sit down, I start coaching a founder, and they say, we never have any problems in our startup. That's where I know that there's a major problem. Okay. And the reason for that is basically that you want to have an environment where people challenge each other vigorously and are willing to call each other out, because that's what builds accountability. And accountability is essential in order to hit your goals. If you're a startup founder, you're by nature trying something hard. You're by nature doing a moonshot. You're trying to do something different, which means people have to be accountable. You're going to make mistakes, and you need to be able to call people out on that, right? So when you're building these teams, you want to have this diversity. You want to have diversity of perspectives. You want to have diversity on other metrics as well. And you want to have people who are willing to engage in constructive conflict and are willing to challenge each other. Okay. So 8 rules for hiring superstars. And again, we'll have lots of time to talk about this, you know, towards the end of the session. The first rule is obvious, and I alluded to that with Google. When you are hiring, you are not the hiring manager. Let me repeat that. You're not the hiring manager. Your team should make the decision. You and the team should make the decision on every hire that you make, particularly at the early stages. Does anybody have any idea how many people were hired at Google before Larry and Sergey stopped being personally involved in the interview process? Any guess? Put them in the chat. How many people did Google have when Larry and Sergey stopped being involved directly in recruiting?
2,000.
500. That's right. Larry and Sergey interviewed every single final candidate until they were 500 people in size. So you can imagine the insane amount of time that took. 70% of their time was spent on recruiting. Okay? You're never too important not to interview a candidate for your team. I don't care how big you are. I don't care how much money you've made. I don't care how much funding you've raised. Hiring and recruiting is, apart from setting culture, the most important thing you're going to do in your company. If you mishire, it's on you. I always say there's no such thing as a bad recruitment, a bad candidate. The person that did the hire got it wrong. Okay? That also means rule number 2 is that we have to invest time in doing the hiring process properly. I cannot tell you the number of startups that I come across where they go, oh yeah, we did 5 interviews. How long were the interviews? Oh, on average, somewhere between 20 to 30 minutes per person. Seriously? You're not gonna know the person in 20 to 30 minutes. You're actually not even gonna know them in an hour. All right? An hour is the minimum amount of time because you have to ask questions, not just on their experience from a work perspective. You need to ask questions on a personal perspective. And that takes time. Okay? And on top of that, everyone else on your team should be interviewing them as well. Because as I said from my story with Jose, your team, especially if you hire them properly, they are going to see things in the interview process that you are not going to see. So you have to go slowly, okay? How do we assess skills? One of my favorite things that I do when I hire people is I give them homework. This may sound crazy. I get them in the interview and I'm like, okay, so you want to work in marketing in my company? Cool. Here's the ideal customer profile that we have. Here's kind of the business target for this quarter. Go home and write a marketing plan for me. Come back in 2 weeks and present me the marketing plan. Some candidates be like, oh, I don't have time for that. I'm too busy. I have other things going on. Fine. If you're too busy, you're out. You're not in this process. Okay, but one of the most effective things that we can do when we're interviewing is give people actual tasks or a project that they can do either there in the interview if there's enough time. Obviously, if you're hiring engineers, it's easy, right? Easier. You just, you ask them to, write some code or you kind of role play through a challenge that they can do right there in the interview. This is often how people do those kind of interviews for engineering and finance and other things. You can do it in marketing. You should do it in sales. Anybody ever heard this technique for hiring a salesperson when you go, sell me this pencil? Yeah, if the person can't sell you the pencil, would you seriously hire them? You wouldn't hire them, right? So you have to make sure when you're recruiting for any role in your company that there is a way that you can assess their ability to do the job. Either give them an exercise in the interview or give them something that they can do outside the interview and send back to you and present to you, okay? I'm not going to talk about values alignment because we just spent the last 90 minutes talking about this, so values is obvious. One of the things that is a mistake, and we all make this mistake, don't interview candidates when you're tired, please, okay? Friday night, 6 o'clock in the evening, 7 o'clock in the evening, you've been out fundraising, whatever, you're exhausted. Don't interview the candidate, okay? Don't do it for their sake and don't do it for your sake because when you're tired, what happens? Why should we not interview candidates when we're tired? Put your answer in the chat. What's the risk if we interview people while we're tired? We want to finish quickly. Yes, Patricia, exactly. We miss things. Okay? We can lack curiosity because we're so damn tired that we're like, oh yeah, I'm actually not that interested in what you had for breakfast or like the color of your dog. Okay. We rush decisions. Exactly, Eladio. That's one of the biggest problems. The biggest thing is when we interview people when we're tired, we're going to miss things and we're going to make the wrong decision. I almost hired that guy back in Chile because I was tired. I wanted to hire the person so badly to check that box to be able to tell the team, we got it. We got our marketing director. I was tired. I missed things. This guy said things that I didn't pick up on. Luckily for me, Jose and other people on the team picked up on it because we have team involvement in the recruiting process. So they were able to see something that I didn't see because they were actually awake when they interviewed the candidate. Okay. So avoid recruiting people when you're tired. Actually, avoid making major important decisions when you're tired as well. When you get that term sheet from your investor at 12 o'clock at night and they tell you that they need a signed approval by 8 a.m., they're probably not the right investor. Okay? Don't do that. Don't make rush decisions when you're tired. Unanimous enthusiasm. You know you have the right candidate when your team is jumping up and down and cannot wait for the person to start. If you have people on your team that are like, not excited, not psyched, or outright against the hire, then you had better find out why. I'm not saying that you should make a decision on hiring a person that is completely unanimous. Sometimes people will have reservations. The question is why. Okay, that's why when you finish the recruiting process, when you finish interviewing, when everybody has interviewed the client or the candidate, you sit down as a team and you do a debrief. And you ask everybody around the table what they saw, and you give your perspective when. When should you give your perspective on what you saw if you're the founder? In what order do you give your perspective to the team?
At the end.
Exactly. Why?
You want to influence others. You don't want to do it.
Exactly. You do not want to influence others. As a matter of fact, this is one of the golden rules of being a founder, and it becomes more and more important as your company scales. When you're in meetings, speak last. Jeff Bezos did this. He actually talks about it in one of his books on how he built Amazon. He would always speak last because as the founder, your weight carries more, your opinion carries more weight, and you will influence people's thinking if you speak first. Okay? Very important. It is critical that you always assign 10 or 15 minutes of the interview to allow the candidate to ask questions. Why does this matter? Why is it important to get the candidate to ask questions?
So we can see what is the real motivation and their real needs and why they want to join us.
Exactly. Exactly. Really, why else it is important?
What he really cares.
What they really care about.
Yeah.
What they really care. If you're hiring somebody and the only questions they have are about salary and vacation, what does that tell you about the person?
Exactly.
That tells you all you need to know. At that point, you say, "It was great meeting you, Pablo. We'll see you never." Okay? You don't hire people that's the only question that they have. And unfortunately, that's oftentimes the only question people have, right? If the person has no questions, what does this tell you about the person?
No interest or motivation.
It's possible that there's little interest or motivation. What else is possible?
They don't have curiosity.
No.
They're scared. They don't have curiosity. Exactly.
You have to pay the bills.
They just want to pay the bills. Exactly.
It also could be that they have no clue what you just said.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly, right? So it's critical that we give candidates the time to ask questions. And also, depending on the quality of their questions, that tells us a lot about their level of intelligence, their level of education, their level of motivation, their ability to express themselves, right? Good people will ask you great questions. The best people will ask you questions that you will struggle with, right? When they ask you tough questions that you can't answer, then they're probably worth paying more attention to. Yes, Adriana, you have a question.
No, yes, sometimes if this is a good candidate, sometimes they have other offers. And and sometimes they have a lot of questions, and you need to be sure to answer the right in the best way for them, because depending on your answers, sometimes you lost the candidate too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. So sometimes you have to also remember that some people are more shy, right? Some people are not as extroverted in an interview. So if that's the case, you need to make sure that they have another avenue to ask questions. Okay. And there are people like that. Introverts struggle more, right? And it's not that they're stupid and it's not that they're not interested. It's just that they have ways of expressing themselves that are different. So in cases like that, what can we do? What can we do to encourage candidates to ask questions if they're not comfortable asking the questions in an interview?
We have to create like a warm space to the person, that the person feels comfortable with the conversation. The person feels relaxed with the conversation, and because not all people is very extrovert, or maybe there are some people that are tiny. It's different. It's not that the person don't do the question. Is not a response that we say that no, the person is not interested. No, maybe the person is fair, scared, nervous.
Exactly. Exactly. Right. We have to create a safe space, right? And so sometimes maybe because we're the founder, people don't dare ask the questions. Like, oh my God, this guy's the founder, right? So how do we create a safe space? We have other members of the team be available for questions. We have other members of the team take them out for lunch. We have other members of the team take them out for dinner if they're local, right? One of the best interview techniques I love is take the candidate out for dinner if they're local. Because when you give people a couple of drinks and you get them in a relaxed setting, you will be surprised what they will share with you. I've been in situations where we took a candidate out for dinner that we were about to make an offer, and after the dinner, we decided not to make them the offer.
Exactly.
Okay? Because you see things that you don't see. People let their guard down. Once I received an offer from a CEO of a very prestigious startup in Silicon Valley. I was going into his office to sign the offer, and he was having a bad day. And he was recruiting me for chief marketing officer. And I asked him a question. And I was like, hey, we were having coffee. And I said, yeah, what's going to be the budget for user acquisition? Oh, we were having coffee. And he said, oh, I don't believe in, customer acquisition. Our product's so amazing that everybody should come organically. We're never going to spend a dime in user acquisition. Well, I was going to be the head of marketing. So when I heard that I was not going to have any budget for user acquisition, I pulled out of the process. I called the recruiter and I said, we're done. And they were shocked because I was literally going in to sign my contract. Okay. So, the lesson there is kind of like when you're recruiting people, especially if you have the ability to recruit locally, meet with them in person, have coffee, have lunch, have dinner. It will be the best investment you'll ever make, especially if you find out that they're the wrong hire. Okay. And the last of my 8 rules, and there are many rules, but these are some of the major ones, is everyone in your company is a recruiter. There should be no such thing as, oh yeah, Aurora is responsible for recruiting because she's the CEO. Or X should be responsible for recruiting because they're the head of HR. That is bullshit. Okay. When you're in a startup, everybody owns recruitment. In Google, that was the mantra. Okay. Everybody brought candidates. And as a matter of fact, we had an incentive program where if you brought a person who we hired, we would pay you money for that hire. Obviously, as a startup, you can't do that because you don't have the money, but you can do other things. You can say, hey, that's awesome. You brought this amazing candidate. You get an extra 2 days vacation. You get, 2 free sessions of coaching or training. You get access to this online course, to learn digital marketing, right? Whatever. Leslie asked a question. What do I think about panel interviews? Are they really productive? Good question. I have mixed feelings. I think they can be productive. Definitely, they speed up the time. I have done it before. I think ideally, I prefer individual interviews, but panel interviews can be valuable because you know you have different. You can have like a good cop, bad cop kind of routine going on where you have people asking different kind of questions. You have one person observing the other while they're asking questions, so they're going to see certain reactions that maybe the person who's asking the question doesn't see. So it can be good. It can also be a way to save time if you're really pressed for time. What I would say, if you're going to do panel interviews, then have two people maybe doing the panel, but then make more time available. So instead of an hour interview, maybe do an hour and a half or an hour and 15 minutes. Okay. So Alejandra saying we're basing the conversation on the person being interviewed being good or bad, but a lot of times the interviewer is the one that blocks the conversation in a smooth interview because of nonverbal cues. That's absolutely true. That is absolutely true. So as the interviewer, you have to be careful about the nonverbal cues that you're giving. You have to be careful about the kind of question that you're asking and how you're asking the questions. So you do have to practice. You do have to practice, right? So I would suggest that, you know, if you have people on your team that you need to involve in the interview process, role play through it with them a little bit. You know, give them a chance to practice. ChatGPT is awesome because what I always tell people is use ChatGPT as your role-playing partner. You can actually create prompts where you can go in and you can say, okay, ChatGPT, I need to hire this role. Upload the job description to ChatGPT. Pretend you're a candidate. Let's role play through an interview. What kind of questions should I ask? Role play through it. Answer my questions. Evaluate the questions that I'm asking you. How good are they? What did I miss? What should I have asked? Right? So you can use ChatGPT or any other LLM as a sparring partner to develop any skills that you need to develop. Okay. Let's keep going because we got a lot of stuff. Okay. Hugely important. I know that everything I tell you is hugely important. So you're probably like, okay, he said this like 15 times already. Everything's important. The speed at which the new hire integrates and has an impact on your startup is directly proportional to how good your onboarding is. I'm saying that very deliberately for drama, but it's true, okay? The more time you invest in onboarding, the faster the person makes an impact. Let me give you an example. I recently hired an executive assistant out of the Philippines, which, by the way, is one of the #1 smartest things that you can do as a founder as soon as you can afford it, okay? I cannot tell you how important this is, and my company is very small. One of the first things I did was I created an exhaustive document of all the tools that I use, how I use them, why I use them, and all the passwords, okay? And I had them read through that. I had them read through the culture deck. I created a series of looms. How many people know what Loom is? Raise your hand. Loom? Okay. For those of you who don't know what Loom is basically an online tool that allows you to record short videos to show people how to do things. This is absolutely fundamental for startups, okay? The more of these little guides you create as part of your onboarding process, the faster people will figure out how to do shit. Okay, and the easier your job will be. Okay, so I created a whole bunch of these things. So when I wanted to explain to my EA how you go from LinkedIn prospecting to adding people into Pipedrive, to adding them to our email, to sending them the first newsletter, I didn't just walk him through this. I created a loom of this, which I then shared with him so he can go back and look at the video if he is not sure how to do it, and he doesn't need to bother me unless he really needs to, okay? This is all part of your onboarding. So your pre-boarding is sharing any documentation that's useful about your company, your culture deck, your product presentations, your product videos, anything that they can read ahead of time that is going to increase their learning so that by the time they start their first day at work, they should already know a whole bunch of things about your company by the time they start. You should not wait for them to have their first day to start giving them materials. And as a matter of fact, if they're really excited and they ask you for all these materials, that's a sign that you made the right hire. Okay. The second thing you want to do, and this is completely new, and you will not have heard this before, and this is going to be a very cool concept that I'm sharing with you guys, is you want to create for them something that's called a baseball card. Now, I'm going to explain what the baseball card is in a minute, okay? And I'll go into a lot of depth on this, so don't worry if you're freaking out. You're like, what the hell does he mean by a baseball card? You want to have them create a baseball card, and you want to share your baseball card and your team's baseball cards with them, okay? Third, you want to create a 30, 60, 90-day plan. So you want to make sure that first week that they're starting, that they know exactly what they need to deliver in the first 30 days and how they're going to be measured. First 60 days, how they're going to be measured. First 90 days, and how they're going to be measured. You can generally tell within 30 to 60 days if the recruitment that you made is a good hire or a bad hire. I can tell within 2 weeks, generally less. If I fucked up a hire and I have to let the person go, I know that very quickly, right? Now, generally, it won't be a complete mess up. You can always go back and you can always train them and you can always course correct or coach. But within 30 to 60 days, you'll know. And that's why it's important for you to have a lot of clarity on what are they going to be doing? How are they going to be measured? What tools are going to be using? What are the KPIs? Okay. And the last thing that you want to do when you're onboarding somebody is you want to make sure that they can get a couple of quick wins as early as possible. Why is that important? Why is it important to get quick wins for a new hire?
To motivate them.
Exactly. Motivation. What's the other reason? Besides motivation, why else is quick wins important? Retention, sure. What else? Self-confidence.
I didn't really get the question, Patrick.
Sorry. Why is it so important to make sure that our new hires have a couple of quick wins as soon as possible?
Autoestima.
Autoestima. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right. Self-confidence and the belief that, hey, I can do this job. Most people, when they start a new job, they're a little bit nervous, right? They should be. Right? If they're not nervous, that means that they're probably not stretching themselves, that it's probably not a challenge. And if it's not a challenge, that's probably the wrong person for the job. The best people for the job, especially your first hires, are people that are not exactly sure that they can do it. You're stretching them, because when they're stretched and when they grow, they're nervous. And when they're nervous, they're going to work their butts off, right? They're going to really be motivated. Okay. So you want to get some quick wins so that you build their self-esteem, you build their self-confidence, you build trust, right? They feel like, wow, I'm having an impact. I was actually able to get the newsletter out this week. And, we had 150 new followers on our Instagram channel. And hey, I'm figuring this out. It's very important to get the self-confidence piece down early because they are going to make mistakes. It's normal, right? And so when you get that self-confidence, you get some quick wins, they develop the resilience when they actually make mistakes later. Okay, that's key, right? So let's talk about baseball cards. What do I mean by baseball cards? Anybody here ever collect baseball cards when you were a kid? No? How about soccer cards? Okay, Radio. So, and Juan, right? So, Juan, why don't you tell us what is a soccer card? Why did you used to collect them?
Because you have all the skills of the soccer players.
Mm-hmm.
And the difficult of get one is pretty the goal to get. So the Messi card is difficult to get.
Sure.
Everybody wants that.
Sure. What else does it tell you about the player?
All the skills, how many soccer teams they be part, or how many goals he get, or how many, I don't know, all the background of the player.
Exactly. Right. It's a snapshot of the player. So this is a new concept, which is I'm not inventing this from scratch. I wish I could take credit for this, but I can't take credit for this. How many people have heard of a very famous Wall Street hedge fund investor called Ray Dalio? Raise your hand if you've heard of Ray Dalio. Anybody know Ray Dalio? Okay, a couple of people. Not many, unless if you're in finance, you know Ray Dalio. Ray Dalio is the founder of Bridgewater Capital, which is one of the most successful hedge funds in the world. They have a couple of thousand employees. They have tens of $billions of under management. But one of the things people don't know about Bridgewater is they are famous for their recruiting, their culture, and their values. They are awesome. Okay, they are one of the hedge funds with the best track record in the history of the industry, apart from Warren Buffett at Berkshire Hathaway's. Ray Dalio wrote a famous book, which I highly recommend for entrepreneurs, called Principles. And in that book, he lays out his principles for how to build and run an organization. And one of those principles is the baseball card. Okay, what is the baseball card? The baseball card, as you can see on the screen, is basically a summary of this person. Okay, it's a summary of this person. So here you have Sam Mitchell, right? And what do we learn about Sam Mitchell in the baseball card? We know that he's a product manager. We see that he has an ESFJ personality type, console. We see that he grew up in Wilton, Iowa, that he plays 5 musical instruments in his spare time. And then we see his core values, right? The values exercise you guys just went through, that's where this comes from. We see his core values. We see what Sam is excited about, what motivates him, right? But we also see kind of like, what are Sam's fears? What's Sam afraid of? Okay. And most importantly, we see what are Sam's saboteurs. Okay. What are the thought patterns that trip Sam up and that can impact not just his ability to be effective at his job, but also his ability to get along with others as a human being? Okay. There is a test which you can, yes, by the way, just answering Victoria, yes, you will get it. You will get a copy of all the slides. So don't stress if you miss something. There is a test which is basically called the PQ. I'll put this in the chat. Saboteurs Assessment online. Okay. This test is free. I would encourage every single one of you on this chat today to do this test on your own. We don't have time to do it in the session today because we don't have enough time. But please do this test for yourself. Yes. Okay. When you do the PQ Saboteurs Assessment, it will tell you what your top 3 saboteurs are. What are the thought patterns that hold you back? When you take this test and you see the assessment and you see the results, you will laugh and you'll be like, oh my God, that's so true. Okay, that's so me. Saboteurs are stuff like, I'm a procrastinator. I'm a pleaser. I am a hyperachiever. I'm an avoider, right? I hate conflict. I'm hyper rational. I always look at things through numbers or there has to be like a logical explanation to everything, right? The point is the saboteurs are a vital part of your baseball card. Okay. So when you create a baseball card for yourself as a founder and you share that with your employees, what is the effect of you sharing your baseball card with the rest of your team? What do you think happens when you create a card like this and share it with everybody on your team?
Empathy.
Yes, absolutely.
We get trust.
Yes, we build trust. Absolutely. Why?
Because you know each other, so you know how to rely on the people you can rely on.
Yeah, absolutely. Just like Leslie said, we're giving them a blueprint about ourselves, right? This is exactly how you create high-performance teams very quickly, right? And the answer to the question that was asked earlier, Victoria, is yes. You ask your new recruit to build their own baseball card. So once you have everybody in the company have a baseball card and everybody's sharing each other's baseball cards, magic things start to happen. You avoid miscommunication. You collaborate. You trust. You don't judge others. You set people up for success. I know that, the reason that Lauri didn't answer my email is not because Lauri doesn't like me or because she thinks I'm a jerk. It's because Lauri knows that this is a difficult question and she has a saboteur she has the avoider saboteur. So she avoids conflict. It's not because she's a bad person. It's because she doesn't know how to manage conflict. And so she's uncomfortable answering my email. Okay. So building the baseball card having your new hire build a baseball card, sharing that with the team, and having the team share their baseball cards is a huge, huge win. It will also really surprise people because people do not expect it. Like even the freelancers that I work with now, my executive assistant in the Philippines has my baseball card. He knows everything he needs to know about me. He knows that if he shows up late, I'm going to get pissed because I hate it when people are not on time. All right. It's like one of these quirks that I have. All right. So the baseball card, huge tool, very easy to use, very easy to put together, a little bit harder to share. It will take you out of your comfort zone, but trust me, it is invaluable. Okay. Rituals for strengthening teams. We're going to go through this very quickly. Again, you'll have the text in the deck, so you'll be able to look at that. I want to make sure that I leave time open for questions. Daily check-ins. Okay. When you're hiring new people, again, the more time you invest in them, the faster they're going to get up to speed. I have my administrative assistant. He's been with me about 6 weeks now. I check in with him every single day. Sounds like a lot. Every day, 20 to 30 minutes minimum. The first couple of days, I was spending an hour with him. Okay. The more you do these check-ins, the faster the person builds trust, the faster they do things the way you want them to, the more confidence they have, the faster they can ask questions that are difficult, the less mistakes they're going to make. Daily check-ins, huge. Okay. Gratitude circles. Okay. This one only applies once you have a team of minimum of 2 or 3 people. You can do this very easily when you have your team meeting. You don't need to do this all the time. Okay. You can do it once a week. You can do it once a month. It's a very simple thing where you take 5 minutes and you say, let's spend 5 minutes giving thanks and being grateful to somebody on this team for something that they do for us. Nobody ever does this. And I can tell you, if you do this even once a month or a couple of times a quarter, it builds a huge amount of trust and it makes people feel valued. It does not take long. It can take 5 minutes. Okay. Gratitude circles are huge. Walk of life. This one is not for the faint of heart. If you are hardcore into culture and you really want to step out of your comfort zone, you can do this. I do this with teams all the time that I coach. I do it with high performance teams that are further along and bigger. The walk of life, basically, you get everybody together in a room. You give people 5 objects. You put those objects on the floor, equal distance from each other. And then you have one person at a time go from one object to the next and share a very difficult moment in their life. They get about 6 minutes. And at each object, they take a step. They talk about what happened to them, how it influenced them, how it made them be who they are today. They take another step. They do it again for a different moment in their life and another until they do it 6 times. If you have everybody in the team do that, you will get to know each other at an unbelievably deep level very quickly. It builds a huge amount of trust. Okay. Shout outs. This one's pretty obvious. I think we all do this. You know, I'm speaking probably to the converted here, but, you know, give shout outs to your people when they do things, whether it's on Slack or whether it's on a Zoom call. Celebrate wins, you know, reward good behavior that aligns with your values. I want to celebrate Leslie today because Leslie is awesome and she turned in this project on time and it was huge and it was hard. And Leslie epitomizes our value of think like an owner. That's a shout out. Takes you 30 seconds. Okay. Try and do shout outs at every team meeting. Don't overdo it. Otherwise it loses value. Okay. Failure postmortems. We are all going to massively fail. If you use OKRs as a tool setting framework, you will see that failure postmortems are actually part of the framework. And that is why Google and companies that use OKRs are so damn good, because they spend as much time analyzing failure as they do planning for the next quarter. Your quarterly planning process, which should generally be at least 2 days, you should spend the first time analyzing all the things that went wrong and openly talking about why they went wrong and what you learned. And then you use the second day planning on what you want to do next quarter in terms of your goals and in terms of what you learned. Okay. Failure postmortems are huge because they build trust and they communicate to people that it's okay to fail. The important thing is to learn from it and not make the same mistake again. Okay. And last but not least, I just talked about the baseball card. It's a huge ritual. It's very powerful when you do it. Okay. And I think Ray Dalio and Bridgewater showed us how valuable this is. And if they can do it in a hedge fund that manages, $300 billion worth of assets, I think it's a good indication for the rest of us that a tool like this can be very powerful. All right. Google did some research 10 years ago, and you can look this up in Perplexity or Google, wherever you want. It's called Project Aristotle. Okay. They studied 80 high-performance teams across the entire business for 2 years. They wanted to try and understand what makes one team at Google so much better than another team. Because even Google being Google, there are teams that can write code 5 times faster. There are teams that sell 10 times more than another sales team. So what they were trying to understand is what makes a high-performance team. The answer is right here, okay? First, high-performance teams have dependability. That means that when they say they're going to do something by a certain date, they get it done by that date. When I was at Google, when the engineering team told us the next version of the Google Play Store will be launched on June 9th, on June 9th, it was live. Okay, dependability is a critical part of high performance. Second, structure and clarity. Okay, in startups, yes, this can vary, but high performance teams know exactly what their job description is, how they work with others, who is responsible for what, and how they're going to be measured. Okay, ambiguity is the enemy of high performance. If your teams don't know exactly where their responsibility starts and ends, or how they're going to be measured, or by when things are due, you can't have high performance. Okay, you need to be very clear about what you expect from people and what they're supposed to do. Third, this goes back to what we talked about in culture, so I'm not going to beat a dead horse. High performance teams do a job because they feel that the company that they work for has meaning. The best people don't do the work that they do for a paycheck. They do it because they believe in your purpose and in your vision and in your mission. That's why vision and mission and purpose are so important. Okay, the high performers, they want to work in mission-driven companies, and they have the choice to choose a company that's mission-driven versus one that's not. Fourth, impact. High-performance teams want to understand exactly how their work impacts the company. At your stage, when you're early, it's pretty obvious because there are few people, there's a lot to do, so the impact is obvious. As you get bigger, this becomes harder. So you always want to make sure as a founder that people, when you ask them to do something, they understand why you're asking them to do it and what the impact has on the organization. Okay? So clarity is essential. Understanding impact is essential. But the most important trait of high-performance teams is what's called psychological safety. There is an entire book written on this, which I'll put in the chat here. If you're really a geek and you want to learn more about this, there's a book written on this called The Fearless Organization. It's written by a Harvard professor called Amy Edmondson. This was written back in 2005, so this is not new, okay? But the best teams have what's called psychological safety. What does that mean? That means that when, Eradio wants to raise his hand because he disagrees with something I just said, he is not scared to do that. He will do it. It means that when Adriana has a really good idea and she disagrees with Eradio and she has a better idea, she doesn't have a problem saying that. It means that when Juan knows that he's going to miss his drop delivery deadline for next week, he doesn't have a problem in coming and telling me that it's going to be late and why it's going to be late, right? So high performance teams operate in a space where it's okay to make mistakes, it's okay to be late, it's okay to, be angry, it's okay to generate conflict because there is enough trust on the team to have these difficult conversations. This is why teams that avoid conflict are toxic. Okay? You need to have a team where there's conflict, where people are willing to have tough conversations. Because tough conversations is where all this stuff comes out. All right? Exactly. Nobody likes to work with someone who only finds errors and remarks at them all the time. You have to have both, right? You have to have people who, they give you the credit when you do things well, and they're also willing to kind of talk about things that are ugly and things that don't work as planned, okay? These are really the 5 traits. Again, if you're more interested in this, there's a lot online that you can read about Google's Project Aristotle. It's all online. There was an article written in the New York Times. And of course, Amy Edmondson's book goes much, much deeper. It talks about a lot of case studies that talk about high-performing teams, okay? We're running out of time, and I want to leave 6 minutes for questions. So I'm not going to go into Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team. The only thing that I will tell you is, please review this slide deck. Please review this slide specifically. There is an entire book written on this, which is a lot of fun to read. It's short and it's very useful, which is called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, written by Patrick Lencioni. Okay. And he talks about a parable of a startup that has dysfunctions. And it's actually, since you guys are all entrepreneurs, you'll really laugh and enjoy the book because you'll be like, oh my God, this is so true. And on top of it, it's a short read. You'll get a lot out of it. But have a look at this slide. Check out Patrick Lencioni's book. It's really intuitive. And the basic thing that you need to understand, which we've talked about a lot, is trust is the foundation of all great teams. When you do not have trust, it compounds and creates a lot of other problems in the organization, which ultimately leads to an inattention to results. All right. And there's a lot of logic, but you can Google this up. You can read about Patrick's 5 dysfunctions of a team. All right. Homework. I'm big on homework as we wrap down for questions. If you want to take all this stuff that you've heard me talk about for the last 3 hours, that's why my voice is totally starting to crack right now. Things that you can do that'll be awesome and be so powerful for your company. Please create questions based on your values. Okay. Please take your personal values and think of how they apply to your company. Please create your own baseball card. Okay. If you're interested in knowing more about the baseball card, there's an explanation in the deck. You can write an email to me. I'll explain to you how to create one. I'll share with you my baseball card. This is one of the most powerful tools you'll ever have. Check out Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team and think of what are the dysfunctions on your team. You will identify patterns. Okay. You can rate your team on Aristotle's 5 traits. The 5 traits I just talked about for high performance teams. Think about how that applies to your co-founder, you and your team. It's an interesting exercise. Try and review that once a quarter. Okay. And lastly, I talked about rituals. Think about what are the rituals that you can create in your own startup that help to build trust, because as we know, trust is the foundation for great teams and successful startups. Okay. That's it. Happy to answer any questions that we have in the 3 minutes remaining. Sorry we didn't give enough time for questions this time around. It's a lot of content. And obviously, these are all the places where you can find me, follow me, or whatever. Okay. Hope that was helpful.
So, yeah, feel free to jump in. Radia, I don't know if you
Patrick, one question. I know we talk a lot about values. Very specifically, do you recommend, is there a very effective number of values that we should set in the company? Because sometimes you can end up with a list of 10 and 15 and then
4 to 6.
No more than 6. Okay.
4 to 6. Remember, less is more.
I have a question, Patrick. Thank you for everything. It was a great session. I have a last question. Now we don't have salary for our employees. They're working for equity. So the same purpose, the same principles that you're explaining apply for the people with equity, or we have even harder for that?
So what? I'm not sure I understood the question.
I mean, we have to be more careful about, because we don't have money, so it's only about the purpose and the equity. That's a kind of
be careful with equity, right? Be careful with equity because it's the most valuable thing that you have. So you have to be very careful making sure that you're not giving equity out to people who don't really deserve it. It also can create problems with the rest of the team if you're giving out, equity to people, and they start to compare. Well, I didn't get that much equity. Why is this person getting equity? So in some cases, it does make sense. Particularly for certain advisors or more senior people that you could not possibly pay, get advice, right? Talk to people who have given out equity before. If you're using advisors, I believe YC, or maybe it's Founders Institute, but they actually have a framework that you can download for free online that it gives you an estimate of like how much equity to give to certain kind of advisors based on your stage, right?
Founder Institute is the one that has it online.
Yeah, FI. I mean, I used to be a mentor at FI, so yeah. Adriana?
Yes, I thank you so much, Patrick. I love your session, but you mentioned the culture deck.
Yes.
And I think that it's a part of the business plan of the company. You can have your mission, vision, values, and the rest of the culture. But I love the term of culture deck. Do you have a reference or something related to that?
I do. If you send me an email, I can send you the old culture deck of my last company. Otherwise, if you just go online and Google culture deck, you can find a bunch of Google of decks online. Netflix, GitHub, HubSpot, all these companies, Airbnb, they all have their culture decks publicly available for download.
Perfect. Thank you.
Aurora.
Patrick, 2 questions. One, what do you consider during the performance evaluation, and how frequent do you do? And especially when you want to also value not only skills, but in value, what do you consider when you're doing those performance evaluations with your staff?
I do, I when I had staff, because right now I mostly have freelancers, I would do performance evaluations every quarter, but I would do one-on-one meetings every week, and every 2 weeks I would generally talk about kind of like career direction and skill development, just to try and understand what people were motivated and excited by, and what they wanted to learn to stay with the company and stay motivated. So, one-on-one meetings for 45 minutes to an hour, mandatory. Having a conversation about skill development and career aspirations once a month, pretty mandatory. Performance reviews quarterly. Guys, because I've got another call starting right now that I'm late for.
We'll let you leave, but Patrick, thank you so much for joining us today. I think it was a super valuable session. We'll share all the slides, the resources, the materials you mentioned with you guys, so no worries about that. And Patrick shared there also his contact details, in case anyone wants to follow up. So yeah, thank you so much, Patrick. This was awesome.
You're more than welcome, guys. I left my email in the chat, and again, you guys will get a copy of the deck. You have all my socials and all my stuff. So happy to answer any further questions. Wish you guys the best of luck. Get some rest this weekend. See you soon.